And today is the first time that we've live streamed Tiger Day, so we're really excited.
And for this live stream, a bit of a change of pace this time. Obviously, you recall that many live streams we've done with the Tank Museum before, we've raised funds for the Tank Museum. We thought it was only right and proper for this live stream. We're actually going to be working in a collaboration with War Child UK and raising funds for the Ukraine emergency appeal. But more about that later on, and more about how you can become involved and donate, of course, if you wish to.
So coming up, we've got all sorts of things for you for the next 3 hours. We've got 2 hours of a historical stream where we're going to be exploring all different aspects of Tiger 131 and how we work with it. We've got brand new content which you've never seen before, and Richard's going to be climbing inside, outside, all over the vehicle and having a whale of a time. Plus you'll have the opportunity to put your questions to us throughout the live stream, and we'll try and pick those up towards the end.
And now, just to introduce, we've got our third host today. A lot of you will recognise him. He is, of course, the World of Tanks stream host. It's Mr. David Bagley.
Thank you. And yeah, welcome. Some of you will recognise me as Ikibu. And so today, as was mentioned, we will have a fundraising for War Child, which hopefully should appear on your screen shortly. And basically what you can do is you can go to either the Tiltify link to donate directly if you'd like to support the cause, or alternatively, you can go to worldoftanks.eu and also follow the link that's in the chat, in the Twitch chat, and then buy the emblems and charity, basically supporting via in-game goods and decorating your tank that way. Alternatively, for those of you just on Twitch, you will be able to get yourself some Twitch drops. You will see the asset there. You can also follow the link that's in the chat throughout the day to make sure you stay informed and have a chance of winning yourself consumables, premium tanks, more premium days, as well as 3D styles. You should be able to see those on your stream and your page right now. And yeah, so basically, just keep watching, follow to the end of the day, but don't leave us. And I think after that, basically what we're going to do is you pass you over back to Richard and Richard, who are going to take you through the next guess from the next campaign.
Now, people visit Tiger Day from all over the world. This is the only place in the world you can see a running Tiger tank. Some come from further than others. I'm delighted to introduce Sarah McDowell here. And Sarah, you've come from quite a long way for Tiger Day, haven't you? Where have you come from today?
I've come all the way from Boston, Massachusetts in the United States, so quite far.
And you're a museum volunteer?
I am. So I work at the American Heritage Museum, which is right in Stowe, about 40 minutes from Boston. I've been there about 2 years, and I love it. Love tanks.
And what do you do as a volunteer there?
So basically, I work with visitors. I do tours, answer questions, kind of a professional know-it-all, I guess. And that's what all of us volunteers do, and it's amazing. A lot of the people are veterans or just huge nerds like myself who really love the history and love the tanks.
Have you got a favourite vehicle?
Of course I do. So
Of course.
So I've got two. One of them is a little bit obscure, and that is the Matilda II. Not usually everyone's favorite tank.
Sound British choice, I would say.
It's the best tank, obviously. So I love the Matilda II, and I also love the Panther as well, just because the one that we have is Jacques Littlefield's Panther, fully restored, fully operational, and it's an amazing tank.
Now, some people watching won't know much about the American Heritage Museum. Tell us a bit about the collections.
So the collection at the museum is from Jacques Littlefield. So he passed away a couple years back, and we got the entire collection, auctioned off very much of it, keeping like the key artifacts. And so building the museum around the collection, that's out in Stowe now and is run by the Collins Foundation. It's about 40 minutes from Boston, and it's really great if you want to see some tanks in the US and can't come all the way over here.
And how, if people want to learn more about it, Sarah, how do they get in touch? Or
So if you go to AmericanHeritageMuseum.org or look at the American Heritage Museum Facebook, there's a ton of information about the museum and really cool photos of what to see and what you can do. You can even drive a tank, which is very exciting.
Fantastic. Well, Sarah, I'm so glad you could come over and join us
Thank
for
you so
Tiger
much
Day.
for having me.
It's a long way to come, but I hope it's been really worth it for you.
It really has. This is an amazing collection.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And lovely to meet you. And what we're going to do next, though, we're going to cut over and we're going to watch our first live stream video where Richard is going to be climbing all over Tiger 131, and he's going to be telling us about how it was captured and how it was generously donated by the German army to the Tank Museum's collection.
Not only is Tiger 131 the only working Tiger to have survived, it was also the first to be captured intact by the Western Allies.
so how was it that this prize fell into the hands of the British Army?
It's April 1943. and the German army is on the retreat in North Africa. Falling back on the city of Tunis, the German army has rallied its forces to stop the British advance with one last counterattack. Tiger 131 has practically just rolled out of the factory when it was shipped to Tunisia in late March of 1943.
Assigned to 504 Heavy Tank Battalion, it was issued to number 1 Company, number 3 Platoon, and because it was a commander's vehicle, it was given the number 1, hence 131.
Now, on an anonymous hillside to the west of the ancient city of Tunis, Tiger 131 is advancing towards its final action. British infantry, the Sherwood Foresters, have single-handedly dislodged the desperate German defenders at point 174. Lacking their promised tank support and having suffered heavy casualties, the defenders are dug in, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. Tiger 131 moves towards the summit of the ridge alongside infantry and several other tanks that crash into the British positions.
With the enemy now in full view, Tiger 131 begins to engage the infantrymen who are fighting for their lives. It looks hopeless.
What no one knows is that 500 yards to the rear, 9 Churchill tanks of the Royal Tank Regiment have arrived. They are just in time to salvage a dangerous situation. As they open fire, they are spotted by the commander of 131, which reverses behind the ridge and manoeuvres up into a new firing position.
It fires its 88mm gun and with one shot destroys one of the Churchills.
But 131 is now exposed, and to make matters worse, its engine is playing up, probably overheating. It is unable to reverse into a more favourable position. As it sits there, it is peppered with shots from every direction in a desperate defence. Sparks fly as machine gun fire clatters to the front of the tank, and at least one Piat round, bravely carried into position by Sergeant John Oscroft, bounces harmlessly off. From behind, heavy 6-pounder anti-tank rounds rain in from the Churchill tanks, hammering into the front of the tank.
One round grazes the underside of the barrel and smashes into the turret ring. The impact caves in the superstructure above the driver's head and sends hot fragments of metal flying around inside.
Almost certainly injured, probably concussed, and certainly feeling vulnerable, the crew are seen to abandon the tank to make good their escape. What became of them remains a mystery. One account suggests the crew were shot as they fled, but another suggests that they survived, but suffered a lifelong stain of dishonour for abandoning their tank without destroying it as instructed. We will probably never know for sure. Back in Tunisia, the Foresters held on to point 174 in a dogged defence, apparently unaware of the significance of the prize abandoned on their position. They would see high-ranking visitors poring over the vehicle with interest and excitement in the coming days, before the situation stabilised and Tiger 131 was finally dragged away from the battlefield.
The British had finally acquired an almost pristine example of a tank that had been causing concern as the invasion of Europe loomed. Now its secrets could be revealed.
Repaired by the Remy, it was used almost immediately in a training film to help British tank crews identify and kill Tiger tanks. Then, it was put on display as a trophy in Tunis and in London, before being fully evaluated at the School of Tank Technology.
It's strange to think that this cherished museum exhibit is itself a war veteran that played its part on the wrong side of history. British soldiers fought for their lives in its shadow. Some would have almost certainly been killed or maimed. It's important we don't lose sight of this.
Even though the Tank Museum has owned this vehicle longer and run it for more hours than its previous owners, this tank, despite its awesome appearance, remains a symbol of a dark regime and a very dark time in our history.
What a great video, Richard. I think it's actually a really fair point at the end of that video. That it's important not to lose sight of the fact that, yeah, the Nazis were on the wrong side. This was a piece of equipment that was a weapon of oppression. And if you look at how we run this vehicle, there's always two aspects to it. One is this is a fascinating piece of technology, and it's one of the most important military artifacts in the world. But it's also it's there to remind us about what had to be overcome by Allied soldiers. This was the Second World War wasn't merely a victory. It wasn't an easy victory. It wasn't a victory at no cost. And to take on and defeat Tigers, in the words of one veteran, Joe Eakins, who we knew very well, it was bloody frightening.
Absolutely. So, as we said previously, the aim of this stream is to raise funds for War Child UK. And I'm very delighted to say that we've got Tom and Dylan, I've got that right way around.
That's the right way around, yeah.
Tom and Dylan from War Child UK to give us a bit more background and information about what it is that this incredible organisation actually does. Guys, first of all, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Maybe you could kick us off by sort of, an outline of what it is War Child do.
Sure. So I'm sure it's no surprise that children are incredibly vulnerable when it comes to war. All their support structures, they need to be in place, so they get food, water, aid, shelter. And when they start to break down, when schools aren't available, when parents either are taken to war or whether they're displaced from their homes and their families, they're in an incredibly vulnerable situation. So War Child aims to go in as soon as war breaks out. And it stays there long after the news cycle moves on as well. So the idea is that we're there for the whole cycle of war. Our mission is to provide immediate aid, immediate shelter, immediate sanctuary when war breaks out. And then as the war goes on and the needs change and things start to settle, we're there to provide psychosocial support, which is helping children heal from trauma and that sort of thing, ensuring they get education, just really ensuring that their childhood can remain as normal as possible.
So what kind of things are happening particularly in Ukraine with you guys at the moment?
Yeah, so in Ukraine, we're mainly active in Romania and Moldova at the moment, because it's actually quite difficult to get on the ground in Ukraine. So in those countries, we've got mobile units that are going around and sort of providing psychosocial support to children who've been impacted by the conflict. We're working with the UN on their Blue Dot centres, which is sort of one-stop shop centres for refugees to get information and advice. We're training teachers and social workers to give care to children when they encounter them. We're also working with sort of human trafficking organisations to make sure that refugees don't fall into the hands of human traffickers. Then in Ukraine itself, we're sort of building partnerships with organisations on the ground there so that we can provide psychological support to children who have been traumatised by this war. And in particular, we're also working with organisations who work with Roma children in Western Ukraine, because they've been identified as a particularly vulnerable group that we could really help.
And I spoke for all our audience. I mean, what actual difference do donations make? We hear obviously so much. There are a lot of charities in the UK, and it's always, where will my money actually make a difference to your role and the people?
Yeah, I mean, it is impossible to understate how important donations are to us at the moment. Our work in Ukraine is sort of rolling out as we speak, and that's coming from our emergency response fund. So that means that if war was to break out in another country, not only are we not as prepared as we would like to be, it also means that we have to divert funds away from Ukraine where they're sort of doing invaluable work at the moment. So it's important more now than ever for us to sort of get donations in any way we can. It's also worth noting that for a short period until the end of May, if you're a UK resident and you donate to our emergency response fund, the UK government will be matching that as well. So your money is going to go twice as far, and that's going to help not only children in Afghanistan, Afghanistan, Ukraine, but also in Yemen as well, where the match money is going to be spent. So yeah, I can't tell you how important donations are at the moment.
And how can people go about supporting it?
So specifically in terms of wargaming in the world of tanks, I think there's two main ways you can go about supporting us. So there's the emblem sale, which you guys are hosting. So that's where you buy an emblem and it goes in your tank in the game. And all of that money goes to our emergency response fund. Or you can head to the Tiltify page, which should be linked, and you can donate. And that money that's donated via Tiltify is the money that will be matched by the UK government.
Fantastic. And I hope everyone watching can appreciate this. This is a really important thing to get behind. This is a great opportunity to try and support a charity which is on the ground helping people to recover from the consequences of war. And that's one of the things we exist for as an organisation here at Tank Museum. It's great to have this opportunity with World of Tanks to support you today. So you are watching the Tiger Day live stream from here on the World of Tanks stage at the Tank Museum in Bovington in Dorset in the south of England. Up next we have Richard Cutland talking about the origin of our Tiger and the origin of Tigers and how they're developed and how they came to the battlefield. And Richard's going to be talking to the Tank Museum's curator, David Willey.
We're here now surrounded by tanks of various different nationalities and eras.
But where does Tiger I fit into this origin story of the tank? To tell us more, David.
So how far back do we want to go? I mean, if you really want to start the early part of the Tiger story, it dates back into the 1920s. Germany, after World War I, they're looking at the fact the French have built a massive tank called the Char 2C, and it's a huge tank. The French never get to use it in action. It's this idea of the breakthrough, the big tank that's going to lead an attack. And in the 1930s, when Hitler comes to power, the German military starts a program to build a breakthrough tank. And a number of models go through prototyping stages, but they don't actually get to production. And these are in about the 30 to 35 ton class of vehicles. So big and heavy for the time. They're using that German system of interleaving the road wheels, so you spread the weight out for a bigger vehicle. They're not sure what weapon they're going to put on it in those early days, but because they've got some work there, when Hitler comes along later, Henschel, one of the manufacturers, has got something to be able to have a look at. So it's when Hitler reads the reports of the 1940 campaign, that's when Germany's invaded Holland, Belgium, France, met the British and the French tanks, the bigger tanks that they were fielding, like Matilda II, the Char Bs, sometimes the Samoa. 37mm, the standard German anti-tank gun fitted on the Panzer III, the early models, they're just bouncing off that thick armour. And Hitler reads those and says, you are going to need a tank with more armour protection and a bigger gun. And in essence, that's the beginning of the Tiger programme. It starts the project in May of 1941, and he's saying, basically they suggest, I say they, all his inner circle, we want to see the prototypes running on his birthday the following year, 1 year to design a super heavy tank. This is a really tight schedule, hence Henschel going back to what have we got in the cupboard, looking at some of their earlier designs they can help put forward. Porsche, so the standard agreement for the Germans is you have two companies compete in essence. They design the hull, the transmission, all the bits and pieces other than the turret. The turret comes from a third party, and that's Krupp. And that's why when you look at these early pictures of the Porsche's submission and Henschel's submission, they've both got the same turret on the top. Porsche himself is not really a weapons person. He's more about transmissions. He likes the idea of petrol-electric drive. He's consistently trying to come up with ideas. He's a great mate of Hitler's. Ultimately, they make him head of the Panzer Commission. He is very confident he is going to get this order for this new super heavy breakthrough tank that gets called the Tiger. It's Porsche who names it the Tiger. He likes the idea of the animal names. He's overconfident. When they do trial for Hitler, Porsche's vehicles have engine fires, they break down, they don't finish the circuit, Henschel's do. Now the recommendation therefore comes from the military, let's go for that one. And so it's by August of the same year in 1942 that they decide, right, it's going to be the Henschel one goes into production. And again, you go back to look at that short space of time. No wonder here and there this is going to be a vehicle with some teething trouble, but that is a remarkable process they've managed to achieve in wartime to get a super new heavy weapon designed, prototyped within a year.
And you say, but also the crews on that. I mean, I always thought for this time period is so short. You consider what, we go through, a year and a half, 2 years for your different trades within a tank crew, but this was so rushed in. I mean, how do you think the crews cope so quickly with such a new vehicle?
The fact that some of them don't have much in the way of training time, they may have trained on other vehicles, but the Germans are trying to keep the standards of training up. But this particular unit that this tank was issued to is a good example. They're only formed a month before they're shipped out to North Africa and Tunisia to fight the 504th. So there is a level of improvisation that's having to go on, even though, when you step back from it, it does look like these are the prestigious units. They tend to get the best guys that are picked for those units. And this is certainly, this is 4 times the cost of a Panzer IV. Yeah. And when they're being instructed, they're being told what an important bit of kit this is. You look at that Tiger Feeble, within it, they're being told this is something your family has worked X thousand hours for, it's cost this vast amount of money. This is something prestigious in terms of a weapon system.
So, David, the ATA, I mean, obviously a flak gun, but, you know, was it that good a gun?
Now, just before the Second World War, the Germans realised if they're going to attack France, they're going to have to attack the Maginot Line. So they actually issued the flak crews with an armour-piercing round, because armour-piercing can be used against pillboxes, chip away at the concrete, and they thought this was going to be necessary to get through the Maginot Line in the original German plans. So there you've got a gun that has not only got this fantastic amount of propellant, case size, you've now got an armour-piercing round. It's big, but if you can get that on a tank, you have leapt forward than when you think about in something like 1940-41, when they're putting on 37mm was a standard anti-tank gun. Suddenly 8.8 is what that, back to that Hitler, he's looking ahead, he's basically saying, I want you guys, the German military, to every basically fighting season, every spring, I want you guys to be going into action with something that is well above and well over what the enemy are going to be fielding that year. And when he comes out with the 88 on a tank, he's done that. And the interesting thing is, of course, in the early days when it appears on the battlefield, get over those teething troubles, it really is a step change. It really does actually present something new. You know, the idea, 100mm armour, 10 centimetre thick on the front, what else has got that? The idea of an 88mm gun firing armour piercing, that's going to knock out most things it can come across, you know, out to about 2 miles away. You know, that's a sizable blooming distance there. Good optics so they can see it. Tactics of, you know, early days, it didn't matter so much where you presented yourself on the battlefield, as long as you were facing forward or at an angle to present the best, thickest armour as a target. Because actually, early days, you're almost invulnerable.
I always wonder if the crew, you know, were they, you know, they were obviously aware of all this, but as a, you know, ex-crewman yourself, do you go into, because there's nothing worse, I always think, than going into a battle thinking you are impervious to everything, because, you know, you will be proven wrong at some particular point in life.
Yeah, and they've got also, you know, there's Otto Keris's memoirs, you know, and there's one person in the who always seems to end up losing tanks for them, and it's not because of enemy fire, it's just because he's not so savvy, or he's certainly not with his driver, that they end up in going across a bridge that collapses. They drive into boggy ground. You know, there's plenty of ways you can lose a tank as heavy as this without it be something to do with the enemy, you know. So that idea of gear changing, nurturing, driving the vehicle in the right sort of way is very important, just to get it to that engagement where once you are there, fingers crossed, you're going to have the advantage from the German point of view, but it's the Germans who have done that initial leap, and it's Hitler who's pushing that.
What makes Tiger One? You know, you've worked with it now for a lot of years, I won't say how many years, but a fair few years. I mean, what do you know, appreciate about Tiger One?
I don't know. Is it like a bit like a Spitfire or other things where they've created their own myth around them, or we've created a myth around them, that ends up having this extra little bit of an aura? There is no two ways about it. There are times in the Second World War, this is the dominant force on the battlefield. So yes, it does do things, but there's not that many of them. Many more other tanks. You know, we don't acclaim the Sturmgeschütz when it knocks out way more Allied tanks. We don't acclaim anti-tank guns that knock out even more Allied tanks than Sturmgeschützes. So it's not about its actual combat prowess, even though there's one or two very famous occasions where it seems to, you know, best everything on the battlefield. There's something more about that, whether it's its look, whether it's its period, whether it's the time it comes in, whether it's every time you see a picture, their crews in the top looking as arrogant as hell because they can be, you know, feeling. So, and equally, you know, a weapon of war from the side that lost. So, you know, but why are we still fascinated? Every generation comes to it. We talked earlier, you know, sometimes you feel like, we said, all there is possibly to say about the Tiger, but every year there's another kid that turns 15 and wants to know about it, or somebody's played the game, or they've done this, or they've made the model, they've done all those things that bring a new generation, and you just have to admit this is one of those ones they seem to either know the name of, want to know more about, and it just seems to look the part.
Yeah, even when I did my basic training across the road there, I mean, we used to come over here like after hours, we were allowed in to have a look around, but everybody, of course, made a beeline for the Tiger One, so it's just quite incredible. And I suppose the movies and everything else.
Yeah, it's our help. And we always say, you know, we're real classic dichotomy here at the Tank Museum, because one minute we're trying to sort of put it in a perspective, just remember there weren't that many, Shermans, T-34s, much more important, and then the next minute we're saying, whoa, come and look, Tiger Day, come and see our tank, let's have it in the Fury and do anything. So it's that kind of, you know, we are hypocrites here in doing that way, because, and it is, you know, we're an independent charity. If this brings in interest, the public, finding out about the stuff, if it's the way they do that, then, you know, who are we to stop in the way and say, no, you shouldn't like this because, you know, it was a bad thing, or the other side of the coin, you know, you shouldn't like this because it wasn't that important. But it's always a bit of a dilemma that way, but I think that will be a story that continues. We'll consistently have that, oh, you know, was it that impressive? Did it really achieve what it costs the Germans to build, etc.? You know, that debate will continue.
Brilliant. David, thank you so much. Really interesting.
Good, thanks, Sam.
You're watching Tiger Day live from the World of Tank stage here at the Tank Museum in Bovington in the south of England. They are formidable beasties, aren't they, Richard? And as a former tank crewman yourself, how would it feel to be outmatched by something like that?
Well, we're talking, funny enough, obviously we were discussing this with David, and of course, you know, when we talk about the myth, but of course, you know, initially the myth wasn't there. You know, myths have to build, and I think we're all guilty of building the myth, you know, the following days. But as a tank crewman, I mean, I made the comment in the video there that, of course, the worst thing you could do as a tank commander is to go into anything feeling, you know, impervious. Otherwise, things are going to slip. Your tactical positioning is going to, you know, fall down a bit, etc. And also, but if you think of the German side of it, I mean, the lack of training. Now, I would have hated the idea of, I mean, we're not even talking an operation, we're talking war. You know, to go into war with a piece of equipment that I wasn't 100%, you know, confident, trained on, or, you know, had experience. Every vehicle ever built has got full balls.
For the guys who are operating Tiger 131, 4 weeks
exactly.
at most?
I mean, that's quite incredible. So, of course, on their side, it must have been quite, oh, you know, how is this going to work? Is it going to be reliable? Is it going to be, you know, is it as good as we've been told it's good? And for everybody going up against it, yeah, of course, I think we do underestimate sometimes. We always, you know, we concentrate a lot on the machinery, but of course, you know, a good crew can make a good tank amazing. You know, a poor crew can make an amazing tank quite dreadful. So it's all about how you control it, how you move it, the positioning and everything. You know, there's no such thing as an impervious tank, ever.
And I suppose, and actually on the flip side, if you look at from the guys on the Allies side, you've got that equally bad feeling of being very pervious indeed to this thing. But again, a good crew can respond extremely effectively.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, the thing for the H8 was the range. I mean, that was the biggie for the range. You know, they'd never experienced anything with such a range, and that must have made a huge, you know, as a commander there, you're thinking, I have got to get the range down before I can actually accurately attack. So, which is why, of course, they adopted the techniques, the tactics to, you know, adapt to that.
Well, the German guy stands off 1.5 miles away
and takes pot shots.
And off he goes.
Yeah.
You are watching Tiger Day live here at the Tank Museum, and next up we've got another video looking at more aspects of Tiger 131, and in this next video Richard is going to be looking with the Tank Museum's team about how we maintain Tiger 131 and how we get it ready for Tiger Day.
What does it take to keep the world's only working Tiger 1 in operation? In this video, we're going to find out about the challenges and responsibilities of keeping this rare 80-year-old veteran in action. Tiger 131 hasn't been run since last year. So before it can be run at Tiger Day, the museum team must carefully check it over. Starting a tank is certainly not like jumping in your car and turning the key. This extended first parade procedure takes around 2 to 3 hours to complete. To talk me through it are with the museum's workshop advisor, Mike Hayton, a man who knows more than anyone else alive about running a Tiger tank.
And Mike, would it be fair to say, I mean, everybody always says about the Tiger that the maintenance was incredibly taxing. Is it a true fact? Is
Absolutely true, yes, in every respect.
So with this, doing it, if you didn't do this process, so if you literally jumped in and started it, what would happen? Cause catastrophic failure or something?
Possibly, yeah, and it probably wouldn't start because what happens is during the winter or during the period it stopped, all the petrol drains back into the tanks, so we have to get it all back up into the engine.
So the first thing we're going to do, I think, is lift the back decks. Now, obviously, you're going to use a JCB today. Yeah. How would they have done it back in the day then?
Well, it says in the manual 4 crew to lift the back decks, and I don't suppose any of them have got any toes left. I really, it's incredibly difficult.
Having safely lifted the deck, and ensure we all still have our toes. The first task is to disconnect the fans from the engine by putting their drives in neutral.
The reason we put it in neutral so there's less pressure on the engine when we turn it over, so it won't be turning the fans, it's just simply turning the prop shaft and the engine itself.
I was saying, Mike, this is obviously not the original engine. The original engine's on the deck over there.
Yeah, so the original engine was what they call an HL210, which was an aluminium blocked engine, and they had quite a lot of problems with it, with overheating and so on. And when the tank came back to the UK, the original engine was sectionalised as a teaching aid. And so the tanks sat in the museum for many, many, many years until the opportunity arose to put a later engine, which was actually a conversion anyway. So as the old engines expired, so they were replaced with the HL230, which is what this engine is.
Do you know the first thing that struck him, Mike, when he lifted up the back decks, though, was how small it is, comparatively speaking, to what I'm used to on vehicles?
Yes, it's a fairly small engine. It's very short, and you know, almost either the tank was made to fit the engine or the engine was made to fit the tank, one of the two. And as you can see, there's absolutely no room between the engine and the side of the engine compartment.
Over your years of experience, I mean, would you say, we were talking a bit briefly off air about it, but do you think it's overcomplicated, what we always hear about everything to do with Tiger One?
I would say out of 10 it's 11.
That bad?
I don't know. It's you know, for us in the engineering side of it, we love it because it's just a great big Meccano set, you know, and it keeps on giving us surprises and things that we learn every day on it. So from our point of view, it's brilliant. You know, Shermans are boring because they never go wrong.
The next job is to check the levels of oil in the engine.
So we know that there's oil in the tank, and we know that there's enough oil in the tank to pump oil around the engine.
And in the fan drive gearboxes.
So once again, we've got oil on the bottom of this. So again, we know it's safe to run it.
And that there is enough coolant in the radiators, which are either side of the engine.
Right, the radiators are filled with distilled water mixed with 50% antifreeze.
And then we could check the fuel levels.
The Tiger has 4 fuel tanks, all together holding about 560 litres. There are 2 upper tanks, which are below my feet here, and then 2 lower tanks, which are really well down in the hole, down about there somewhere. Actually, that is one there. The 2 lower tanks are reserve tanks, and each hold 90 litres. We run the tank on just one, the left-hand tank. Providing that there's fuel in the upper tank, we know that the lower tank has got 90 litres of fuel in, which is more than enough for Tiger Day. We're tending to run it on avgas, which is the old 4-star fully leaded, and mixing it with some modern stuff, which the old engines love. And you can hear the difference in exhaust notes between the 2 types of fuel.
With the levels all checked, it was time to prepare the engine for starting up. Before this can be done, the engine needs to be turned over a few times, and I was eager to get stuck in myself.
I've been told that you need some exercise.
Yeah.
So we're going to give you some.
Lockdown.
How's your bad back? So what we do to start the tank without using the electric starter is the inertia starter. And what it is, so starting handle is similar to a car. It starts off very slowly, and you have to wind up loads and loads of gears till it gets to the point where you can't stop them. Nothing will stop them. If you put a big bar in, it'll just shatter to pieces. So once it gets the inertia in these cogs, so to speak, we press this button here, and that engages the starter, and it turns the engine over about 6 times. When I say stop, just move away, okay? Let go of the handle and move away.
Right.
Keep going. Okay. Okay. That's it. Turn the engine over about 4 times, The clicking you can hear is the backlash on the magnetos. In other words, as the magneto goes over, it goes over and then clicks over to give it a really good spark. So we need to do this about 6 times. Next.
Sorry? How many times?
I stepped aside to let some experienced hands take it from here, and we were soon ready for the next step.
So the next job is for one of the crew to go inside, turn the master switch on, and then pump the primer pump about 20 times. The driver then gets into his seat, keeps his eye on the oil pressure gauge to make sure that as soon as the engine turns, we've got oil pressure. And then we get to people we don't like, maybe, to turn the inertia starter, and hopefully it'll start.
And of course, it's always started.
Yes, yes. Touch wood.
Now for the moment of truth, and I again found myself heaving the heavy inertia starter to start the world's only running Tiger tank.
Just getting oil pressure now.
This was my first attempt at getting the starter to engage, and it was harder than I thought. So by the time I'd forced it in, the revs had fallen away, and so the engine didn't cleanly start. I was more confident for our second attempt.
Okay.
But then this happened. And I thought I was going to be in big trouble with Mike.
What's that, Mike?
Fortunately, the Tank Museum's head of collections, Chris van Schaardenberg, was on hand for a little advice.
You need to build up a bit more inertia. I think you're starting early in the sequence.
Okay. Well, if you stand on the side, just give us a shout when you're
Yeah, when you're completely knackered, I'll go for it.
Third time lucky.
Okay.
And bingo. Just listen to that. Now the engine would need to be run for about 3 minutes whilst the tank was static. The team were keeping a close eye on all levels whilst looking for leaks or other signs of trouble. With everything looking good, it was time to reverse the tank out into the yard for a further inspection.
Okay, Mike, she said we're going to leave it out here now for 15-20 minutes or so. What sort of things are you checking out here?
Well, first of all, we check, obviously, all of the track pins to make sure that these little circuits are on, because if a track pin wears out, we lose a track. So that's part of the first play procedure, where we check each one of these pins, and also checking the tyres to make sure that they're okay on the rims, and also that these nuts are tight, because Tigers were notorious for those nuts undoing and the wheels flying
I always
off.
thought with Tiger, when they're interleaved, interlocking, it must be really painful to remove them. And,
It's unbelievable how many wheels you have to take off as well just to mend a puncture. So once we got to the back, another job we do, put our hands there and you can feel the air coming out through the fan, so we know the fan gearboxes are operating correctly. Round the back. Obviously we take this out now and put this back in its keeper. We don't need it again now. Once we've started it got cold, this is redundant. Again, nice warm air came out of the fan, so we know the fan's okay. We've done checks around the engine, we know that the engine's not leaking oil or water. Once again, checking the tracks and the wheels, and hopefully before Tiger Day this year we'll give it a good clean.
now that to me, Mike, looks like the track's a bit low. Is that just the way it's positioned at the moment?
It depends where it is. With the differential on these tanks, if you just roll to a halt, one track will be tight and the other will be loose. And so you'll find the other side will be tighter than this side. So what we have to do is get it on a level ground, same as Chieftain, neutral it, and then adjust the track so that it's missing the first 2 road wheels.
Slack to back, same track, slack to front. We can't finish that phrase, so.
No. So, once we checked all of these things, obviously we check all of the hatches to make sure that they're secure and that the tank's ready to go.
Brilliant. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
With everything appearing to be running smoothly, the tank was driven back into the museum, ready to play the starring role of Tiger Day.
You're watching Tiger Day live here at the Tank Museum in Bovington, live from the World of Tank stage at the Tank Museum. And Richard, you nearly broke our tank.
I knew you were going to say that. I did not nearly break your tank. I have to say, I mean, what a great honour and privilege it was to spend some time with Mike and the team there. So, you know, it doesn't matter how many times I've visited the museum, but to hear that insight from the guys who worked on it so much, it was absolutely fascinating. So, brilliant. Thank you to Mike. Thank you to yourselves and the rest of the team. We're now with the Head of Collections, Chris van Schaardenberg. Chris, Head of Collections, what does that involve?
Hi Richard, good to see you again. I work closely with the archive team, with the exhibitions team and with the workshop team. So I look after the collection and its presentation, I guess.
And Chris, you're an engineer by background, and you're responsible for looking after the sort of holistic whole of the Tank Museum collection. So when that tank backfired, then I lost about 6 months.
All about the backfire.
I lost about 6 months of my life expectancy. What was actually going on there?
It was, I think the engine was slightly overprimed. We have a priming pump, which Mike probably talked about, and to start a procedure, and I think they slightly overprimed it because the pump wasn't working right. They filled a bit of neat petrol down the carburetor, and you could see it coming out both ends, to put it bluntly. The flame out of the exhaust is just onboard fuel that. So
it hasn't necessarily completely broken our tank.
It's you don't want to do it every day, but it's okay. You see it sometimes on the big radial and the aero engines as well, when there's just too much fuel in the exhaust and they just burn it off.
Chris, what's it like to be, the custodian of such a rare vehicle?
It's quite a responsibility in many ways. It's a unique vehicle. It gets. You want to make sure it's right, and that's why I'm so grateful for Mike and the team. They have been sort of working with this vehicle for quite a few years now, because it's all about the knowledge in the end. The more the drivers and those that operate it closely get to know the vehicle, the better. And we keep rotating our drivers through it so they all have an equal experience when it comes to driving the vehicle.
Sorry, live.
Yes. But Mike, especially credit to Mike and his team that have been looking after this vehicle for so long, because they know when something is right and when something isn't right, because it's often a decision-making process. If there's a small fault, can you work with it? Can you live with it for the show? If not, when does the point come of saying we can't accept this? And that's where the knowledge of the team really comes into it.
It was quite amazing there with Mike. There were certain points that things like noises, and Mike was straight away sort of like, identifying something that perhaps wasn't quite right at that. So yeah, quite incredible, obviously, his experience on it.
And I have a bit of a reputation for always jumping up and down next to the vehicles, but normally what I do, go to the team, guys, does this sound all right? What are we listening here to? What are we hearing? Because once you have, as an engineer, I guess, once you have an explanation of what's going on and you can place it, you say, fine, this is okay. If you can't place it, some new sound or knocking, and no one can quite figure out what it is, that's probably time to say, all right, this is a Tiger Day, maybe without Tiger. But so far, Mike and the team, we've always managed to come up with an explanation, and we're happy with how it's running so far. But it's
on that sort of, it's an interesting point, isn't it? A Tiger Day without the Tiger would just be kind of day, really, wouldn't it? And we do quite a lot of displays here, and we've normally got quite a range of vehicles. But Tiger Day, of course, is dependent on one in particular. And how nervous do you you feel sort of in the run-up to Tiger Day in terms of its runnability at any given time?
Yeah, as you said, Richard, we do 42 tanks in action this year, 3 big events, of which 2 Tiger Days. And yes, Tiger Day without Tiger is a bit awkward. So once Tiger has done its first lap, I'm happy, we're happy, because the rest, we had 2 breakdowns today, few people maybe realized it, but Tiger was fine, and the rest is all fixable, by the way, but the rest is nice to add to it, but it's all about this one vehicle. And I keep saying, because Richard keeps asking me, of course, how long can we keep this going? I said, well, even 80 years ago it was unreliable, but yeah, it's some interesting decisions coming up ahead in the years ahead, I guess. What do we do with the vehicle? Do we keep running it? Do we say eventually enough is enough, because it's still a lot of original material? It's always that balancing act between a museum and a running collection.
Now, of course, I mean, we can only begin to appreciate that you are a charity, of course, down here, so everything is on, the kindness of others to keep the fleet going. I can only imagine it must be incredibly expensive to keep it going. So how can people support the museum?
Well, yes, obviously the Tiger Day itself, with all the premium experience, the visitors itself, but also the Friends membership, the Patreon membership, and just the merchandise. All this material we sell specifically.
Merchandise we're surrounded by.
Yes, we're surrounded by, like a Tiger tank. We're doing a Tiger, sort of Tiger Feeble. We did a Panther Feeble in the past, and all sorts that really helps us going, and the sponsorship for yourselves, of course. Because yes, it's an expensive hobby, and we have 45 to 50 vehicles, and this is one of them. We look after it well, but there's a lot of other vehicles to look after, so it's a balancing act between the resources and judgment. When is it still good, and when is it time to either look into it deeper or decide to retire it?
And for that kind of decision on retiring, what the kind of, from your point of view, the key criteria that when that moment comes that we're going to be looking at or thinking about?
As you know, Richard, we have set up a nice collections committee team, and also specifically to look at it from an engineering point of view at the running fleet. And during lockdown, we worked on this plan for 2045, what collection we should have running in 23 years' time now. And that was a useful exercise to go through, and also when specifically to retire vehicles. And I quite like the feedback from that team. It's both based in-house people and external experts. When decide if you really start changing track, which is original, gearbox, which is original. Yeah, I think it's a combination of from a museum point of view, when are we not comfortable anymore, just keep replacing items. And same thing, the discussion for the Panzer III, we've started, it's a very original vehicle. When do we say enough? Now it's the museum piece.
And there'll be a chance to put your questions to Chris and the rest of the team later on, but in the meantime, I'm going to hand back over to David Bagley.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you, Richard and Chris, for that amazing moment. So here I am, I'm going to be discussing with you, if you haven't already claimed your Twitch drops. I know they're working. It is for EU only, but you have a chance of getting yourself some large consumables, some premium tanks, some 3D styles, as well as other vehicles that are going along there. If you haven't already, make sure that you link your account. If you're having issues, unlink and relink, and you will be all good. There is a chance of also getting yourself a couple of bits of premium days if you don't get those premium vehicles. Everybody's got something to earn and win. All you need to do is just keep watching for those full 2 hours. Once you've watched the first hour, then you're good. Another 30 minutes, another chance, another 30 minutes, and another chance. So, can't forget that today is also about raising awareness and raising funds for the War Child campaign with the Ukraine crisis. And you can see some of those assets that are on your screen right now. These are on sale. All you need to do is go to wildertanks.eu, purchase these from the store, all proceeds going to that campaign. If you would like to donate directly rather than using in-game assets that you can see on the screen right now, you can go to a Tiltify link that is available and will be sent in the Twitch chat throughout the whole time, and you will occasionally see it as a lower third throughout the stream. So make sure you support it. It's for a worthy and awesome and amazing cause. We saw a discussion earlier from somebody promoting that campaign from War Child directly, which is fantastic. Here you can see some of those emblems that are on the vehicles for you that's around there. Now next up we have the arena show from earlier. Now if you did miss it, we have a quick introduction from David Willey, which we should be able to cut to right now.
Welcome to our Tiger Day live stream. In just a moment we're going to be running out Tiger 131, so we won't be doing any commentary when that goes around, just so you can listen to the engine note of that Maybach engine roaring away. But later on we'll be giving commentary on some other vehicles we're going to bring out to complement the Tiger. So sit back and enjoy this wonderful Tiger Day live stream of moving armour. So we can put our Tiger in context. So with any luck, I believe we'll just give it a moment and Tiger 131 will be appearing for us.
live stream, aren't they? I have no idea. What channel are they on? What channel can I get Nick on? What channel is Nick on? What channel is Nick on?
Probably one.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Tiger 131. You can all go home now. You've seen that run. If you want to stay, we're going to bring some other tanks out for you. So, just a bit of a contrast between how German tank design advanced so quickly in the wartime period. This is an L model, so the Germans use the phrase Ausführung or iteration or mark, as it would be called for us. This is L. They go through the letters. Now, this particular model, Panzer III, is quite late in the production run. It's got a 5-centimetre gun on it, so 50mm long-barreled anti-tank gun on it. It's got extra armour bolted on the front. Now, for the Germans, they, in the 1930s, when Hitler comes to power in 1933, he basically rips up the Versailles Peace Treaty. The Germans have already secretly been working with the Soviet Union, the Russians. They've been sending their engineers, they've been sending some vehicles, they've been developing out to Kazan in Russia. They've been experimenting because by the end of the First World War, Germany had only made 20 of its own tanks. So they're not really a tank building nation. They've got to learn the art. So Panzer I and Panzer IIs, in many ways, are tanks that they learn how to train with. They are armour plated, they can be used in combat, but they're learning their way with Panzer I and Panzer II. Panzer III, which is this fella, Panzer IV, are what they think they want to go to war with. And their doctrine, this awful word that we all run away from, but it's really important to understand, what do they think the tank's there for? Their doctrine is that the tank is going to support the infantry to make a breakthrough. There's still, all the nations are thinking back to World War I, static front lines. How do we break through that front line? And the Panzer IV is therefore going to have a short-barreled 7.5 centimetre howitzer on it. That's how it can fire shells that explode, will blow up pillboxes, machine gun nests, maybe take out anti-tank guns. Then these tanks will be able to go through the gap, almost like a cruiser tank as we sometimes know it, to then go and cause mayhem behind the lines, and they've got an anti-tank gun on them should they bump into an enemy tank. But the idea of tank-on-tank engagements in the 1930s, it's tended to be avoided as a topic almost, because there's not that many tanks out there, so the chances of you bumping into one, let's not worry about that one too much. But if we do, we've got a suitable gun. Originally it was going to be that 37mm gun on the early Panzer IIIs. So they build what seems to be very sensible, very reliable, very good German engineering with these Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. But the German military are basically saying to Hitler, we're not going to be ready for a major war till about 1942, 1943. Now we all know going to war is not something that anyone can actually plan exactly to a date. That tends to go wrong very easily. So the Germans in 1940, they're using their Panzer I and Panzer II. They've luckily collected a whole load of Czechoslovakian tanks, and they're only just starting to put into serious production the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. Now this particular vehicle, it's captured in North Africa. We think at the Battle of Alam Halfa, Montgomery's just taken charge of the 8th Army. He's trying to get his famous phrase, a grip on things. The Germans under Rommel do a last-ditch attack at the British positions before the Battle of Alamein, and then it turns around the other way. The British then do their attack afterwards. So we've got photographs of this particular Panzer L. There it is, being de-bombed, as it were, before it's sent back to the UK for analysis. And most of the German tanks we have here in the Tank Museum are ones that were captured during the war, returned to Britain, so we could work out what's the best way of trying to defeat them. Now this Panzer III's got some original battle damage still on it. We're not too sure exactly where it was captured, but we do know the unit, and it's been one of those vehicles that's always been a bit of a runner here for most of its history at the museum. You'll see photographs of this running around in a grey colour back from the 1960s. So there it is as a complement, two vehicles, Tiger I and the Panzer III, two running bits of German armour, but also a really good contrast between how far that Tiger, look at the difference in scale there, look at the way that's suddenly jumped what seems to be like a generation, coming out with a vehicle that is just so much bigger, 10 centimetre front armour. You've got about 5 centimetres on the Panzer III, even with add-on armour bolted on the front. The size of the gun, 8.8 centimetres. You're firing a round that's designed for going up to about 30,000 feet to knock down a bomber. They've already come up with the Tiger, or the Flak 88, they've already come up with an anti-armour round because they thought they were going to use the anti-aircraft guns to knock away the Maginot Line, take out pillboxes, etc. They've used it already in the Spanish Civil War. They know how powerful that gun could be against a target like a tank. So by putting it on something as big and heavy as the Tiger, you've got a really solid platform to fire that very powerful gun from. Now, crawling around, if you can see it, right down the far end there, going at a lovely sedate pace, is our Matilda I. Now, this is a tank that Britain first designs. It's a guy called Sir John Carden designs this vehicle to a budget back in 1935. because a guy called Hugh Ellis, who's Master of Ordnance, he was the guy in charge of the tanks in World War One, says we're going to need something that's like they're going to call an infantry tank. A tank that can support the soldiers going forward, like we did in the First World War, nice and slowly, because we don't want to lose the soldiers. They can go maybe marching pace, about 3 miles an hour, as they go forward. Oh, I wonder if he's... I think he might have overheated. He's stuck down there at the moment. But it's got really thick armour on the front of it, because they knew, being so slow, it was going to have to take some punishment on the battlefield. And the Matilda 1... 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiment, they go out to France in 1940. That thick armour is one of the reasons Hitler decides to go along with the Tiger programme. Now, if you're out in the arena a bit earlier on, you would have seen this vehicle. Stuart was talking about it. Again, trying to put vehicles in context. This is what Japan did for a tank back in the early 1930s. Goes into production in mid-30s, actually was making them pretty much to the end of the war. This is the Type 95, or the Har-Go, the third model, basically, of tank they built. Now this is, again, this Japanese tank designer, Tommy O'Hara. He sounds like an Irish comedian, Tommy O'Hara. He comes up with the idea of bell crank suspension system, which if you look on the side there, you'll see a wheel goes up, pushes a cylinder back down, and that's in essence is a long cylinder-like spring. The gun, 37mm gun there, is not that powerful, but with 2 machine guns, in the one at the back of the turret, one in the front there, you're looking at a vehicle. When this is designed, it's about equivalent to the American M3 tank, the Stuart light tank that goes into service early in 1941.
Now it's made by Mitsubishi. It's got a diesel engine.
Now it's made by Mitsubishi. It's got a diesel engine in the back. Why we always not particularly rate Japanese tanks, it seems to be over time, is because tanks are not Japan's priority. They like the idea of ships and planes because they're an island nation. They're doing a lot of island hopping. So most of the steel production in Japan goes into shipbuilding, not into tanks. So this is a tank that when it first goes into service is very effective. Like we often say, having some tank is better than no tank. And if you're fighting against people like the Chinese, as they did when they invade and in Manchuria, this is going to be effective because there's very little in the way of armour that's coming back at you. So the Har-Go, it does see a fair bit of service throughout the entire war. And this particular one, as Stuart was mentioning earlier, this was basically buried with about 20 others on a Pacific island after the Americans took it. They bypassed it. They waited till Japan had been defeated. When they then took over the island, this ended up being buried in the ground. Later it was taken to Japan. It then came back to the UK. It's been restored out in Poland. It's a privately owned one that's running. It's then going to end up going back to Japan probably in about a year's time. So this is probably this and maybe Tank Fest the last time we'll see it running around here. The equivalent from America. America by 1939 in its entire history has only made about 380 vehicles. I mean tanks, that is. It's made an awful lot of trucks, vehicles in the way of cars, etc. of course. But what it is doing in the 20s and 30s, American military budgets, people like MacArthur, they hang on to people. They don't spend money on equipment. They just do experimentation. So when war comes, they are ready to then throw money at the problem, and they've got prototype systems such as the suspension, such as using the radial aeroplane engine in the back of this vehicle and that 37mm gun. So they put these together in a hurry. It's the British that first used these tanks later in 1941, and because of their American reliability, the fact they work very well, they're easy to maintain relative to most British tanks at this time, a British soldier calls it a real honey, and that name stuck. We call it officially, Churchill likes the idea, instead of all these abbreviations all the time that we forget which one's which, M3A, whatever it is, Churchill says, give me names. So they call American vehicles after American generals. So this one is after General Stuart, Civil War general. But for the troops, on the whole, if you read a lot of the accounts, honey goes down really well. It's a honey because they love it. Small turret, you can see, two-man turret. Again, in the front of the vehicle, you've got a driver and co-driver. The big radial engine in the back, that's part of the problem for the Americans. We'll see that with the Sherman. The aircraft industry wants them. They're big, round and tall, so the drive shaft goes right through the middle of the vehicle, quite high. Gearbox and drive is at the front. But at the same time, if you can make that vehicle work, it's great for the British. Now, when it goes into service, it's very similar in terms of specification for that Japanese Hargo. Even for some of the earlier Panzer IIIs, you're really looking at a match there. But of course, very quickly, we're seeing those bigger, better armoured and better armed German tanks going into service. So with the British in North Africa using the M3 Stuart, very quickly we have to change our tactics. You cannot go up in a stand-up fist fight with this vehicle against something like a Panzer IV, which can outrange you with its firepower and has got thick enough armour that you're only going to be able to penetrate that armour if you go around the sides of it. So again, this is how tactics with these vehicles, as the war goes on, has to change depending on where you are, what your enemy is, and what they believe is going to be the best way of using this vehicle. It sees service right to the end of the war. A newer model comes out called the M5 version. This is the M3. They didn't do an M4 because they knew everyone would get confused. The M4 is in everyone's mind's eye the Sherman. So they jumped to the M5. Now you can see it's a relative nippy tank, and that is again back to speed can be part of your defensive mechanisms. Get out of trouble quick, keep moving, keep weaving, don't let the enemy lay their guns on you, because your armour protection on this is pretty minimal, which is worth bearing in mind. So you don't want to be hanging around too long on this one. But there, as it goes past, you can almost see a similar generation vehicle in many ways as that Hargo tank there as we're looking. Now they also made a version of this tank with a diesel engine in. Engines, as we'll see with the next tanks coming on, is part of the American issue. They are, as we said, they experimented in the 30s. They know Congress, the whole idea, it sounds like we're just taking the mick out of the Americans when we say they throw money at the problem. That's their war plan. They knew they had a very small cadre army that should war come, we will expand rapidly, and that's when we will spend money on equipment. They start with the M3 Grant tank, British designers helping with that vehicle. We started off by going to America before they're in the war saying, can you build tanks for us? And that leads on to the fact that afterwards we end up saying, no, we'll buy into the tanks you're going to make because that makes it simpler. Now, after the Grant tank, we then move on very quickly. The Grant basically is an interim vehicle. It has got a howitzer in the hull. The Americans haven't quite got to the point of being able to put a fully 360 turret into production yet that will take a sizable gun, such as a 75mm. Now, as you'll be aware, this particular Sherman, if you look at every Sherman, there's lots of differences. This particular type of Sherman, it's got the later war wider track on it. This one has got a twin diesel engine in the back, because back to, they couldn't make one type of engine in enough quantities, so they basically say to the manufacturers, you come up with what will suit your vehicle that you're making. So this is a twin General Motors diesel engine in the back there. And this one as well has got the later war longer 76mm gun on it. Now 75mm, only a millimetre different, but when we see the 75mm gun Sherman come on in a moment, you'll notice the fact that it's a shorter barreled gun and it's what they call medium velocity. This is a higher velocity gun with the aim that it can send the rounds out with much more force behind them. Now that M4A2, as it would be known, basically M4, the digits that go after it, M4 is Sherman tanks, the digits that go after it are to do with the engine type that's in there, because there's 4 different engine types go in Shermans in the war. The famous radial engine that we saw as well in that earlier M3 Stuart. We end up, the next Sherman that's going to come on has got 5 Chrysler engines all bolted together, one's round a single crankshaft. You have different types of engines for the different manufacturers, because they simply can't make enough. And as you can imagine, earlier in the war, everybody, the Air Force, wants those aeroplane engines. So with American industrial production, which is just staggering in terms of its capabilities, when they put the car industries into this, they basically get the head of Chrysler to take over tank production. They do it on such a scale that in the end 49,000 Sherman tanks are made by the Americans in the Second World War. On top of that, there's other variants as well that are used for other things. And from that point of view, when you see those sorts of numbers, compare it again, however crudely, 1,300 Tiger 1s, you can see it's about mass fighting a different type of quality. Numbers really count. So we haven't got a T-34 today running, but the obvious one is on the eastern front the T-34, on the western front it's the Sherman. Now this particular tank, this model with the twin diesels, tended to be given to the Russians. It was given to Britain as well. It wasn't used by the American forces in the field, even though, as you can see, this is the tank that was used in the Fury movie. Little bit of license there, but we've kept all the bits and pieces. It's got that HVSS, a later model suspension on it. And it was the tank that was a hero tank with Brad Pitt in the top and a couple of our guys 6 months on a film set just north of London. And of course it fought against Tiger 131. It was our Tiger in the film as well that went off site for a couple of weeks and was used as the enemy Tiger tank, doing whatever silly things it did in the movie, like manoeuvring from a position that was perfectly safe for a Tiger. What you would not be taught to do as a Tiger commander, you just sit there and wait for the enemy to come to you, pick them off with your superior firepower and your range, keep your thick armour facing towards the enemy. What you don't do is move and expose your thinner rear end or your side armour to the enemy, which is exactly what happens in the film. Now, another version of the Sherman coming around. This is the one with that Chrysler multi-bank engine. And when they put this together, it meant they had to make the hull just that much longer. So it's one of the ways you can understand, or you can identify, that this has got the multi-bank in it. It ends up with having the suspension slightly further apart, and that means its ground pressure, funnily enough, because it's got longer tracks, it's the one that's got the least ground pressure of all the Sherman tanks. So this would be called an M4A4 because of that Chrysler engine. And again, this is one that the Americans weren't that keen on. We loved it in the British forces. So it was given to Britain. You can see this also has things on it that show it was being upgraded during its lifespan. There's extra armour plate is put on the side of the hull where the ammunition is stowed. Tests revealed it did very little difference to stopping rounds penetrating, but it made the crews feel a bit better. They would sometimes put extra armour on the cheek pieces on the front of a turret. The real difference that saves soldiers' lives in the Shermans later in the war is when they go to what they call wet stowage, because the idea is if you're penetrated by an anti-tank round, it tends to be very hot, molten almost by the time it's got through the metal of your tank. If that sets off the ammunition, you have real problems, as you can imagine, inside that tank. By putting the ammunition in bins with tubes down the middle, but they're surrounded by water, sometimes with antifreeze around that water, so that hot metal spark may not be able to penetrate to get through. It's put out by the water and you might not get that secondary fire. So crew casualties go down later in the war as we end up with wet stowage Sherman tanks going into service. So it's one of those smaller bits of development that really helps the soldier. Of course, they'd all love thicker armour, they'd all love bigger guns, but the Americans, quite rightly, are sticking to a tank of 30 tons. So when the Americans knew about the Tiger, they fought against them in Tunisia. Why didn't they decide to build a bigger, heavier tank to match it? That idea of the Sherman, 30 tons, it's because they had to ship. There's no fighting going on in America. Whatever they make there has got to be shipped all around the world. 30 tons, they knew, is about the maximum weight that most ports, most ships, most derricks, most cranes could deal with. So there's no point in building huge, great, heavy things that we can't support or get to where they're needed. So again, looking behind how they thought they were going to use the tanks, where they were going to have to use them, how they were going to have to ship them. And the Americans saw their doctrine originally was the tank was a weapon of exploitation. Let's go through the gaps. If we meet enemy tanks, we're going to have, originally the idea was tank destroyers, other types of vehicles with heavier guns on, less armour but speed. So things like the M10 as a tank destroyer, later the M18 Hellcat. As we know, that system didn't really work for them. Tanks end up fighting tanks. So by the 1945, the Americans are realising we need to upgrade to a heavier tank, such as the Pershing, and we need bigger guns and better guns put on our tanks, such as the 76mm you can see on this Fury vehicle. Now, I promised I'd go down the other end of the arena for the next half of the vehicles coming on. So, as our other M4 Sherman there, it's just going to come to a halt in a moment. And we're going to look at another very impressive, I think it's about the first time it's come here to Tankfest, the American Chaffee tank. Now, we've seen that M3 Stuart light tank. When the Americans try to replace it, they do the M5 version, which has got thicker armour, but they realise they are going to need a speedy, lightweight tank before the war ends. there is a tank being developed called the T7. Unfortunately, it starts growing in weight, so it's abandoned by the Americans. They then go to Cadillac, who had been building some of the M5 lightweight tanks, and a new design is come up with relatively quickly. It's put into production early in 1944. That particular light tank then sees action in the Ardennes battle at the end of 1944, early 45, and they're actually given out as well to some British crews, and Britain uses some of these lighter tanks before the end of the conflict. Now, it's called the Chaffee by the British. It's still going again. They're American generals. Aidner Chaffee was the guy who helped get the American armoured force together in the late 1930s. He dies of cancer before the war begins, but his product, as it were, his idea of how the Americans should fight goes on into the war, so they honour him by naming the tank after him. And with this vehicle, you've ended up with about a 25-ton vehicle, or they didn't want to go beyond 25 ton, which is why they stopped the T7 vehicle. But this fellow, we end up with about 4,000 of these are made, and the key one with the Chaffee is it's got a really impressive speed to it. It can go at about 35 miles an hour. They keep the armour protection really low, right down to about 25 millimetres, but it's heavily angled, and that of course means that you've got more to go through. Sorry, we're just getting our money's worth out the M4 Sherman there with the multi-bank going round still. And there's me talking about the next vehicle and it hasn't come on yet. So here comes our Chaffee, sorry about that, talking all about it and it hasn't started running around yet, but there it goes. Cadillac build it, so does a company called Massey Harris. Cadillac are the design authorities, but they come up with a new engine in the back that they've also been putting in the late model M5 Stuart tanks, up to about 35 miles an hour, so that's speedy for a vehicle like this. This one's just been restored, so it's in lovely order, and it's painted as a British Chaffee as being used at the end of the war. And I've got an account here. Some of you may know there's a book called Troop Leader by Bill Bellamy. Bellamy was given a Chaffee just at the end of the war. And he says of it, in his memoir, he said, I was allocated a Chaffee tank, Hemlock 3, and that's what's on the side of our restored one here, as my command tank, plus a Humber Scout car, Hurstwood. I was of course used to the latter, but the Chaffee was new to me, and I became more and more impressed by its speed and manoeuvrability as the days passed. Because again, you've got that very thin 25mm armour, you've got a good gun on it. They put a 75mm gun. It's a gun that was originally, it's developed from one that of all things was put on a B-25 Mitchell bomber. It was for ground attack. They develop it further. It's got relatively low pressure. In other words, the rounds don't come out with enormous amount of force behind them. But at 75mm, that still makes a fairly big bang. Again, you are not there to take on bigger tanks. It was certainly turned the other way, one assumes, from a Tiger. But again, it gives you an amount of firepower, and for the reconnaissance role that it's designed for, that works very well, because you can lay down supporting fire, you can lay down smoke, lay down some high explosive, but the speed will get you out of trouble. And it's got a very good ride. It's got torsion bar suspension, so those twisted metal bars across the floor of the vehicle, and that will help give you a good ride over rough countryside. Again, that lovely angled turret, and the chaffee goes on to be used as a bed for a number of other vehicles. An M16 version with anti-aircraft guns. They carried a 155 and a 105 artillery piece as well, and they saw service in many countries after World War II. They get to the war before the end of 1945. They're still fighting in Europe at the end of the war. They don't see a huge amount of action, but they certainly do post-war, Indo-Pakistan war. They're used in the Middle East, even the Far East. You'll see they're being used in Vietnam, Indochina as well. I'm told, by the way, there was me getting worried about these things flying around. They are part of the live stream. The drones that are flying around looking like mosquitoes at the moment, they're actually filming all this for part of the live stream that will be going out. So the next tank we're going to be bringing on in a moment is the British Comet tank. Now, the Comet is a cruiser tank. We looked at an infantry tank earlier on, that idea that things to help the infantry advance. A cruiser tank was there really, it was supposed to be speedier to go through the gap. So we ended up with the A-13, we ended up with vehicles such as the Covenanter, used that as a cruiser tank as well. Again, in Britain, we like the idea of, we got better guns. We got the 6-pounder gun as early as 1940. We got the 17-pounder as early as 1941. The problem we had was, of course, production. In Britain, Churchill said, aircraft and the Navy comes first. And in 1940, you can entirely understand that. We needed fighters to defend ourselves, the Navy to protect the Channel. Only if the Germans had crossed the Channel was the army going to be needed. And so that rule of priority going to the Air Force and the Navy, that continued not just in 1941 but into 1942 as well, which brought our own tank production a bit behind the curve. Luckily for us, those American Shermans and the M3 Stuart tanks start coming over in good numbers, so we end up with those to be able to use in the interim period. What happens is we don't decide to put into production any new designs, keep going the ones in the factory, and that's one of the reasons why some of our tanks seem to lag behind in that mid-war period. Good designs are on the way, and the Comet tank, which hopefully will be coming out sometime soon, will be one of those much better designs. Originally it was intended to fit it with the 17-pounder gun. That's been in development since as early as about 1941. They're rushed out to Tunisia on a ground mount. It's hard to find a turret big enough to put the 17-pounder in. So, for example, we end up building a rather awkward-looking tank called the A30 Challenger to put the gun in. When it comes to putting this gun into what becomes the Comet, it won't quite fit. So they end up doing a new version. It's called the 77mm high velocity gun. The round that comes out the end of the barrel is exactly the same size as the 17-pounder round, but it's got a different projectile case. They use the brass case from the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. So even quite often people call this like a shortened 17-pounder. Actually, it's a very different gun entirely. But it is a high velocity gun. And Britain has now come up with discarding sabot ammunition. So what's that mean? It's the idea that you fire a slug of tungsten surrounded by a pot out the end of the barrel with enormous kinetic energy behind it. The pot falls away and that slug of tungsten flies towards the enemy at supersonic speed and can smash through about a third more armour than what normal armour-piercing rounds can do. So it's a very, very clever way of upping the power of your guns. It was developed at Fort Halstead. Pete Permetter, who was a guy who came over from the Brandt company, he was actually a Belgian, worked with the French, they'd been developing it. He escapes to Britain in 1940, works with a guy called Kopok. That ammunition that they come up with is a world beater. It really does improve the firepower of these guns. Now the Comet tank is also, it's for the first time now, just like as in the Cromwell, we've got powerful engines. Now the engine in the back of that vehicle that's making that glorious noise is of course the Rolls-Royce Meteor. It's an engine that was started the war as a Merlin in the Spitfire. It goes on into the Lancaster. Various other planes use it. A guy called Rowbottom, he manages to derate it. He has a team that puts together what they then call the Meteor. It's got about 600 horsepower. That's about double the horsepower that we were putting in our earlier war tanks. And that means you've got some welly behind you. You've got some oomph that will get you around the battlefield. You are not struggling all the time. And with the Comet there, it's a very good tank. Often compared, again, I'm not sure the Cruise would quite done it this way. In many ways, its stats almost compare with the Panther. The firepower is very similar. With discarding sabot, it's even better. It's got that Meteor engine for power at the back. It's still got the stepped front on the front. Everyone says, why didn't we use sloped armour more? That's because for the Comet tank, they wanted still to put the British Beezer machine gun on it in the front there. And that takes a vertical plate to hold it. The next tank we come out with, we've done away with that hull machine gun. Now the Comet goes out to Europe in the end of 1945. Units such as 7th Armoured Division are training with the Comet. The Germans attack as part of the Battle of the Bulge. The unit then hands back its Comets and picks up its Sherman and its Cromwells again and goes off to fight in those because they considered it too risky to send soldiers off to meet the advancing German tanks in new vehicles they weren't that familiar with. So even though they were ready, they were starting to be issued in December, they end up being handed back and they only see action in the following spring in the defeat of Germany in the last months of the war. But a great tank goes on to serve in a number of other countries, doesn't go to Korea even though people claim it did, but it does see service around the world. The Irish Army, the Finns only took them out of service some years ago. There were some in Burma into service well in the 1980s. Now, the tank that's coming on now with its turret reverse, the guns in its travel lock there, this is the tank we made right at the end of the war. Doesn't see service, the famous Centurion tank, the A41. What happens with the Centurion, it starts off, you can see that front bit now, we don't have a machine gun put on the glacé plate, So they've got rid of that lovely stepped frontage to it. It ends up with a 17-pounder gun when the first ones are made. They are sent out to Germany. They miss the end of the war by a couple of weeks. Operation Sentry, they're trialled in Germany. Everyone realises we're onto a winner here. It's got a good gun, and that gun can be upgraded. So they start with a 17-pounder, they then put on a 20-pounder gun. And that moves on at the end of the 1950s to a 105mm gun. It's got that Meteor engine in the back. Now, the one downside of the Meteor is very thirsty, so the range of the tanks, the Centurion tank, when they first go into service, is not that great. They actually build later models with extra tanks on the rear. Now, the Centurion is produced for the British Army. This particular Centurion has just been gifted to us by Switzerland. And in 1950, Switzerland, after World War II, they want to buy tanks. They're changing their defence policies. They have armed neutrality, as it's called. They end up coming to Britain saying, can we buy the Centurion? We're very keen to sell tanks in the early 1950s. We need money. We're a bankrupt nation. What happens, though, is the Korean War kicks off, and we suddenly need all the tanks we can make for our own forces or our allies or Commonwealth countries. So the Swiss have to wait, and it's 5 whole years before we finally get round to selling them Centurion tanks, and they upgrade their ones as well, just as we did in service. So this one has got little differences on it, different smoke discharges, a different radio arrangement, some different stowage, but they did the same pretty much upgrades. They put that 105mm gun on. The whole issue of that gun, it's a great British design. What happened in 1956, the Hungarian uprising, a T-55A tank was driven into the British Embassy compound. The defence attaché measured the armour and the size of the gun, 100mm gun. They measured the armour and realised, hang on a second, we don't think our 20-pounder is going to be able to go through the front of it. So there's a project at Fort Halstead, Royal Armaments, or Royal Ordnance as it was. They end up pushing forward a design for a 105mm gun, and they come out with an absolute world beater. The L7 gun is put on our tanks, the Centurion. We give it to the Germans, they put it on the Leopard tank, we'll see it in a moment. The Americans put it on the first of the Abrams tanks. And it's back to how sometimes, and I hint about the Ukraine, how a vehicle, one moment we think it's out of date, it's behind the curve, it's not going to be used in the way we think it will be. A little bit of technology, suddenly it's at the front of the curve again. So, and I mentioned that, we're going to see a T-72 in a moment, and the usual one. Most of the tanks we're seeing here, the Americans, 1950, we don't want a tank. One man with a Panzerfaust or a bazooka can knock it out. It is going to be American policy, get rid of our tanks, we don't need them. Korean War kicks off. We have to build tanks very quickly again, or the Americans do. So each time we seem to write off the tank, it comes back again. And the tank coming on now is what the Germans built after the Second World War, using that British L7 105mm gun. Now in 1955 the Bundeswehr was reformed, the German army, for the first time. They're first kitted out with American vehicles. We want them, of course, to join NATO, the West Germans. We are worried about the size of the Soviet bloc, the Soviet army. We must get the Germans back in the fight, as it were. So they then start their program for what they are going to call the Standard Panzer. They're originally going to build it with the French. As with so many of these cooperative ventures, they fall out in the end, and the Germans end up with this fellow, the Leopard, what we now know as a Leopard 1. The Germans had forgotten all about, or decided they wanted purposely to go against things like the Tiger. Thick, heavy armour, we don't want that. We want mobility instead. So the original Leopard 1s only had protection against about 30mm cannon fire. They put a thumping great big MTU diesel engine in the back, give that vehicle power. So you can see there and hear there that sense of power in that engine gives. That gives them speed on the battlefield. That means that the argument was, if you're as mobile as you can be, that means you're less likely to be hit by the enemy anti-tank gunners or tanks. So that's how the Germans took their tank philosophy forward, and they use a great gun. They've used that British L7 105mm gun. So off they go, and where the Germans have been brilliantly clever, they've kept on developing the Leopard. We're now at the Leopard 2A7. We've gone through adding extra armour protection levels have gone up. They've added bigger guns, we're up to 120mm gun, and that tank is now in service in many countries. It pretty much overtook the countries that took the British Centurion tank. After the Centurions went out of service, most countries took on the Leopard.
Yeah. There's another tank coming to us now.
Now in that Cold War, that post-World War II period, the Russians carried on building tanks. They got no qualms that the tank was vulnerable. They kept building tanks, T-55s, T-54s. Then they move on to the T-62 and then the T-64. This one coming on now is a T-72 tank. Even though we tend to think of the Soviet era as being very a monolithic society, production, etc., actually tank factories were still rivals. The T-64 tank, built in Kharkov, was being promoted in Moscow. A rival company comes along with what they considered a kind of cheaper version of an earlier tank, a T-62 tank, and they said, basically the Russian authorities called it would be a mobilization tank. If we go to war, we'll start building it. Very cleverly though, they managed to get it put into production in 1970, and that leads, basically it's this tank here, the T-72, 125mm gun, low profile because they've got rid of the loader. It's now an auto loader. You didn't need a guy standing up whacking the big rounds in there. A round goes in, followed by a bag charge or a case full of explosives, and that's on a carousel beneath the turret. You can see that the height of this vehicle, it's kept low. It's basically a attack tank. The idea was if the Warsaw Pact countries had attacked NATO, there would be swarms of these tanks in echelon. They are not to be lived on, they are there for the attack. Western NATO countries, we tend to think of our tanks as homes. These ones were going to be used on the day of operation, and there will be so many of them that they'd be following up. Once the first wave has gone through, another wave would take over. So the idea of the T-72, it's that Russian philosophy, keep it simple. It's got a diesel engine in the back, very similar to the one that was in the T-34 in the Second World War. It's a development of that. A good, powerful gun, but plenty of them. And they would be used in a certain sort of manner. The issue that we're seeing now, of course, in the Ukraine is very similar tanks. T-72, B3, slightly upgraded ones. But they're being used not as the original Warsaw Pact envisaged them to be used. They're being used what we can only describe as in a very amateurish way. They're not being part of an all-arms force. They're not being protected by their infantry, and they're quite understandably being picked off. it's also pretty apparent that the crew training is not that brilliant. You know, some of these T-tanks have been captured with sights in that are still in their wrappers because newer sights have come along, but the guys don't know how to use them. And with a conscript army as well, you're seeing that situation where unless you're sophisticated enough to know how to get the best, if you've had that good training, etc., to get the best from the vehicle, which some of those Ukrainians are obviously doing at the moment, they're fighting almost the same type of generation tank against each other. So this T-72 is being used by the British Army at the moment. We have recognition exercises. We take it up to Salisbury Plain every now and again. This particular one's ex-Polish Army. The T-72, about 25,000 of them were made. Some were made in Poland, some in the Czech Republic. This is a Polish one, and again, they tend to have lots of different build standards. The Russians themselves did not want the top quality tanks. They reserved for their own military. The standard, the thickness of the armour, for example, is slightly different on those that were made in other Warsaw Pact countries. Now for NATO, our lesson, or certainly Britain's lesson from the Second World War, instead of going light and very mobile, British tank designers, many of them in the 1960s have seen service, of course, in the Second World War. They decided, no, Britain, we wanted to go heavy. We wanted thick armour protection. We wanted a very powerful gun on our tanks to outrange the enemy, and we were less worried about mobility because we were going to be a defending army. We didn't have to race to capture bridges or to get across to the Rhine or Niederrhein. And therefore this tank, the Chieftain, ended up with some of the thickest armour protection of any tank in that post-war period. The Chieftain was fitted with a 120mm smoothbore gun, rifle gun on the Chieftain. It has got something called a muzzle reference system. Before that gun fires, under the cap at the end of the barrel, it's covered now at the moment by a shroud, just the water going down that barrel. There's a cap there, a mirror underneath it. Before the gun fires, it rises to that mirror, bounce back inside the turret, and there's a system that can work out if the turret, or if the gun rather, has got any bend or droop. Bend because cold wind blowing on the side can chill the metal a fraction of a millimetre. It means that your barrel is slightly bent. If you fire at a target 2.5 kilometres away, you're going to miss. So that is computed out before this tank gun fires. And we're now firing at this generation metal darts, about 13 inches long, made of tungsten or depleted uranium. They go through the air. They've got no explosive on at all. They are there to penetrate enemy armour. So Chieftain could engage targets 2.5, even 3 kilometres away. Those metal darts fire at faster than Concorde. As I mentioned, no explosive on them, just the sheer kinetic energy will burrow its way through enemy armour. And quite often as they're doing that, they get very hot. They will therefore cause secondary fires inside the tank they've hit. And a well-trained Chieftain crew, basically, if that gun's onto you, out to about 2.5 kilometres away, you're a goner. First round hits go up enormously with this generation of tank. World War II, even things like the Tiger, 1 round over, 1 round under, 3rd round on the target. Modern tank gunnery has leapt forward. The downsides, many of you here will realise with the Chieftain, with the engine, the Leyland L60 engine in the back had lots of trouble in its service life. Interestingly, R1, I say this carefully, keeps going rather well. They need a lot of careful maintenance to keep them going, the L60 engine, but it was definitely a weak spot. And some of the countries that bought the Chieftain in the Middle East insisted on a new engine in the rear. We've got a version called Khalid that was actually being originally designed for the Shah of Iran. It ended up with the Jordanians. and that's got a different engine than the multi-fuel L60. End of the 1950s, NATO said we want all our engines to be multi-fueled. Most countries completely ignored that. For some reason in Britain, we went along with it and tried to design a big engine that could take petrol, diesel, aviation fuel, bottle of vodka, whatever you want. Chieftain was replaced in British Army service by Challenger 1. That's the tank that saw service in the first Gulf War. And then we went on to the tank that's in service at the moment, Challenger 2. And they're just about to start upgrading Challenger 2 to a new version, new gun. It'll be called Challenger 3 when it comes back into service. And again, that's another one of these ones where, depending on what's happening in the Ukraine, will we decide to actually convert more of them, not less. They will still undoubtedly have a role on the battlefield. Now, this is an American Cold War tank, the M60. Now, after the Second World War, the Americans had jitters about tanks. The 1950s, I mentioned, they decided they didn't really want them. Korean War kicks off, and they have to push forward their development of armour very quickly. They've had the M47, the M48, what they call pattern tanks. This is the M60 version, and in many ways, that family of tanks, they just get bigger with thicker armour and larger guns on them. The M60, it's got that British 105mm gun fitted on it. They were going to have laminate armour placed on it, but in the end, the problems of producing that meant they went back to cast steel. So that huge great turret you see on the top is just a huge casting, almost a mini turret on top of that with a 50 caliber machine gun for the commander and a steel hull with a whopping great diesel engine in the back. Now, the M60 was never a particularly showstopper of a tank, but it was good enough, just like the Sherman. And the Americans made an awful lot of them, I think about 4,500. They were sold around the world. They were passed on to fellow NATO countries, allies. They're still in service. Turkey, Greece, Egypt has a large number. The Americans have taken them all out of service now. They tend to be originally downgraded. What tanks are going to be revived because of what's going on out in Ukraine at the moment, what older tanks might be being souped up again to be potentially used. But the M60, it never ends up seeing combat service in Vietnam. They used other models there. It does see service with the US Marines in the Gulf War, and that was its last time really in action. After the Gulf War, they retire them from service. Israelis had a lot of M60s, and like many tanks as well, this one looks in its bare armour form. The Israelis added reactive armour, those blocks of armour to explode when they're hit. Blazer, it was called by the Israelis, and that takes the pressure of an incoming round or a hollow charge round away from the vehicle. So there's a pretty impressive display of running armour there that's gone around this afternoon. What we're going to do now is we're going to start the Tiger up again, and I'm going to hand the mic over to Mike Hayton, who was in charge of the restoration of the Tiger, used to be the workshop manager, still advising on certain vehicles we run here. And Mike's going to take us through how you do what's called an inertia start on the Tiger. We won't be doing it on the batteries. Well, we might be doing it on the batteries if we can't get the inertia starter to work. But I'll get Mike to actually talk through how this is done. Now, I'm not sure all of you will be able to see what's going on exactly because of the way the tank's positioned, but Mike can explain that to you.
It's been a hard day so far. So what we do with Tiger is it has two starters. It has an electric starter and also a thing called an inertia starter. Sorry about that. And when the tank's been stood for any length of time, it's a court martial not to use the inertia starter to start the engine. So we do a bit of practicing and occasionally use it just to save the batteries. It's a bit the same if you've ever seen aeroplanes when somebody stands on the wing and turns a starting handle to start the engine. Well, it's pretty well the same with the Tiger, it's just a little bit bigger. So what we do is we take a cover off the back of the tank and fit this bracket, which we've already done to save time, and then screw the starting handle into the back of the tank. The starter is a little bit like years ago. You used to have little cars where you could pull them back and then let them go, they go flying across the room. Well, this is the same sort of thing. It uses lots and lots of gears inside the starter to create this really unstoppable piece of kit. So we've got Gary and Steve, all ready to go. So it's very, very slow to start with. So they start turning the starter, and it takes a fair bit of muscle. Normally we use people who don't like to do this, but today is different. And we get it up to speed, and when it's ready to go, it'll turn the engine over about 6 revolutions. Is the ignition on? Okay, try that. So we push a little rod into the back, engages the starter, and it starts. That was amazing. So, for instance, if the tank has flat batteries, we can use this starter to start it. I'll hand you back to David now.
So as I mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, what we'll be doing is the Tiger will then parade off. It'll go back in the museum with our Panzer III. You'll be able to see that again back in the museum fairly shortly. We'll announce that we'll open the gate so that once the tanks are all safely out of the way, you can then come in the arena, as I said a little bit earlier, do watch your footing here, plenty of holes and everything to fall over, and do have a word with the crews, very knowledgeable people, some of whom have been the people who restored these vehicles as well. So I'll shut up again so we can hear our nice Tiger 131 when it's ready to go in a moment.
ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much what the tank off ends our live display this afternoon. A lot of the guys driving the vehicles will help put together their voluntary and put their spare part in and do the back of the floor and just put it on to the
So, ladies and gentlemen, that pretty much, once the tanks are off, ends our live display this afternoon. A lot of the guys driving the vehicles who've helped put them together, they're volunteers. They give their spare time to do this, so do give them a round of applause. They've done very well to keep these all going. Thank you.
Welcome back. You're watching Tiger Day Online. And firstly, a bit of an apology. We have been informed there were a few sound issues during the arena show, but, you know, it's a live stream, so sometimes we do have problems. Richard, another fantastic arena show.
That's good, wasn't it? That drone footage was awesome. Actually, the opportunity to get those different sorts of views that you simply can't get by physically being sort of on the arena. Fantastic. The views of the drive-buzz, the driver, you could see he was a little bit tense. But the drone footage, that was terrific, wasn't it?
How many Tiger Days is that now?
Believe it or not, that is our 16th Tiger Day. And actually, you know, Chris van Schardenberg was mentioning earlier, we do have to bear in mind, everyone could be the last one. This is a 79-year-old piece of kit. It wasn't designed to last this long. You know, it wasn't very reliable 79 years ago. So it's a privilege to be able to do this. But yes, this was our 16th Tiger Day.
So can I put you on the spot right now then and ask you a question which was not prepared or anything? So what's the backup plan then if the Tiger doesn't start Tiger Day?
We just call it day.
Now, volunteers, Richard, we all know that obviously you rely heavily on the kindness of the volunteers down there. How many volunteers have you actually got at the museum?
Altogether, we've got about 90 volunteers. And actually, we in the workshop team today alone had 24 volunteers who played an absolutely key role. We couldn't have done today's display without them. It's just really want to take this opportunity to say to our volunteer team, thank you for all the hours that you give us and have done. For many of these guys have volunteered for us for many, many years. And we wouldn't be able to do it without them.
And the crowd, it looked like it was a large turnout
Yeah,
today.
we had it's about 4,500 in today. So we had about 140 people joined in with what we call our sort of premium day, where these are people who get to sort of put their heads inside some of the stuff and find out from the restoration teams how it works. And then, yeah, we sold out quite a few weeks ago, actually. So it won't be the last opportunity to see it this year, but it's 4,500 today.
And, I mean, we're now post-pandemic, thank heavens. The difference for the museum is it must be quite obvious.
Yeah, well, basically the place comes alive when there's a big crowd here. So the whole purpose of being a museum isn't just, we're not a warehouse. And you can keep stuff stashed forever. But the purpose of us is to bring the stuff alive, is to actually help people understand what it means and to understand, to see things. You know, when you're taking tanks around the arena, it's not just the visual, it's the sound, it's feeling the ground shaking. It's great. It's great having the crowds back.
And when can we see Tiger 1 again in action?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that. So if you missed out on the chance to see Tiger 131 in action today, we will be running again in September. So if you go on the Tank Museum website, tankmuseum.org, all the details are there for the next time it's out.
And now we're going to pop back across to David.
Thank you very much and welcome back, everybody. So once again, I want to remind everybody about the Twitch drops. I think most of you managed to claim those by now, but don't forget, you can still get them if you've joined a little bit late. All you need to do is look at the screen right now and you can see that after 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes and then 120 minutes, you'll be able to claim yourself options of large consumables, premium time, premium tanks, or some customization items. If you are also new to the stream, we also want to remind everybody about the War Child initiative and campaign for fundraising that we've got going on, where you can hopefully see soon on the screen the emblems that are on sale, specifically for this campaign, with the proceeds going to the War Child Ukrainian campaign for the crisis happening there, where if you don't want to donate or join or contribute through the in-game items, you can, of course, use the Tiltify link that should hopefully be appearing at the bottom of the screen sometime soon. There is the link being dropped into the chat very frequently, so you can click on that and then donate directly if you prefer. You can also visit the War Child website, where you can get more information about this and some background if you missed that earlier on when we had an interview with the War Child people. And so, yeah, we've got all of those things there. Of course, like was mentioned, it's Tiger Day, so it's celebrating the Tiger tank. We have the Tiger 131 and various other things going on around that theme on sale as well with these emblems, so make sure you check it out, which is always good news. And of course, we now have the next part where we've been pulling questions from the chat throughout, and so I'm going to pass these questions on to Richard and our next guest, who will be introduced. And so the first question is, how good was the Tiger or Tigers against Sherman or other various tanks that they met at the time? And then I'm going to condense a bunch of questions, a variety of them, is how much fuel does the Tiger tank spend running?
Cool. Well, shall I take the first one?
You take the first one.
That's the first one. So the first one, this question about, how good was Tiger compared to the others on the battlefield, in some ways is the single most important question you can ask about Tiger. And Tiger, we've got to bear in mind, this was not designed as a machine to drive around the Tank Museum's arena, even though it does it rather well, I would say. This was a weapon system, and a weapon system is designed to beat other weapon systems. So how good was Tiger? There are dozens and dozens of books have been written and could be written about this question. The answer is, it all depends by what you mean by good. So if you had one Tiger against, for instance, one Sherman, you would generally expect the Tiger to win, because it's bigger, heavier, it's got a bigger gun. If you're standing a mile away, the Tiger can penetrate the Sherman can't penetrate the Tiger. So Shermans could probably penetrate Tiger, maybe sort of 400 metres-ish. Tiger can penetrate a Sherman from well over a mile away. So one-on-one, theoretically, the Tiger should win, and actually the generally accepted statistic is you'd lose about 3 Shermans to try and take out one Tiger. However, it in reality isn't quite as simple as that, because a lot depends on where they're encountering each other and what kind of people are inside. So if you look at the Normandy battles, for instance, generally the average distance of an engagement in Normandy is less than 400 metres. and a chap called John Buckley, Professor John Buckley from Wolverhampton University, has done excellent research on this. So if everyone's at less than 400 metres, actually it's much more even pitch. Actually, it's not going to go one way or the other. And Sherman in a close battlefield has some serious advantages over Tiger. James Holland, we like James Holland. He's written some terrific stuff, and he's just written a book recently called Band of Brothers. He's looking at the experience of the Sherwood Rangers yeomanry in Normandy. And he has an example of a Sherman commanded by a chap called John Semken, who basically bumps into a tiger head-on in a street, and he's only a few metres away from this guy. And the Sherman gun can fire much more rapidly than the tiger's gun. And John Semken's gunner gets off 3 shots before the tiger can get a shot back off at them, and actually disables the tiger before it has a chance to shoot back. So it's generally, you would say the tiger is significantly superior, and you expect this 3-to-1 attrition rate. However, it depends on the circumstances, and in particular, it can depend on the crew as well. I'll let you tackle the other one.
Yeah. Well, what a perfect opportunity now for the second question, of course, to introduce our next guest, Mike Hayton, who is the workshop advisor. Now, you recall Mike was in an earlier video. Mike is, I would say, arguably the person that knows the most and has certainly had the most experience on board the Tiger One. So Mike, this question about fuel, other than a lot.
It did 2.5 kilometres and used about 50 litres of fuel. Top grade petrol.
So my back of a fag packet on this was, that's about 500 metres per litre.
Yeah, it's bad on the pocket.
It's bad. And of course, we're talking, I mean, this is flat terrain. We're not talking, you know, operational, stopping, reversing, going up inclines and all the rest of it as well.
Although, of course, we have to run the engine for a while to warm it all up before we start, and run it for a while afterwards to let it cool down. So it's still a lot of fuel, and it's always been known as a thirsty beast.
So, Mike, you yourself. So, firstly, thank you so much for earlier on for spending a couple of days with me and going through the preparation that's required for that. Absolutely fascinating to get the insight into it. How did you start your career at the museum?
Long story. I owned a 432 APC, and we used to go in the pub in it and all sorts of things. And it was in the days when not many people owned those privately. So I've always been into track vehicles. And every Thursday, my son and I would come down to the museum and help out. We'd help drive the stuff, mend it, and so on. And there was a chap called Chatty Taylor here at the time. Chatty's a legend, and one of my favourite people, I have to say. And I liked it so much, I said to Chatty one day, "What's the chances?" And I only got that far, and he said, "There's a job here for you when you want it." And that's how I started. And so I ran my business down, and we came to the museum. I started in 1998. And became workshop manager in 2004. And then the troubles began. A thing called TIGER came in front of me, and all of these grey hairs are due to that one machine.
Mike's only 37. So, Mike, what was the first tank you learned how to drive, Mike?
Proper tank was Centurion, on behalf of Chatty once again.
A real tank?
Yes, and he taught me to what they call stick change as well, which all of the people that drove Centurions all the time used, which was a way of changing gear without using the clutch. So as you change gear, you pull one of the sticks, right or left steering, jolt the tank, and it would change gear. And Chatty spent a long time until I got it right. So that was the first tank, and my favourite probably at the time was Chieftain, I'm sorry to say. I loved the Chieftain because what you put into it is what you get out.
What about the Tiger, though, Mike? I mean, how on earth did it was all very well sort of Centurion, Chieftain, that sort of thing, but to suddenly get this beast in front of you, how did you learn to drive that?
Again, it evolved really, because my son worked in Cardiff at the time, and he'd go from Bristol to Cardiff every morning on the train, and we managed to get the German handbook for the tank, but it was in German, and so we had it translated with him helping. And when it came back from Abro, we had some tuition from Ron and Dave, but only what they'd learnt. But the manual gave us a lot more information. So gradually, we between us, we learnt the controls. We managed to do lots of adjustments to it, because it's very fine adjustments inside the tank to get it to work right. And between us, we learned to drive it properly, as it says in the book.
So what's the difference between driving something like Centurion and driving something like Tiger?
Light years. The Centurion is, I mean, it's a great tank for us to play with, but if you have to drive one all day with a gear lever that's about this long and you're trying to change gear with it and you're putting your foot on the thing to pull the steering, it's really a very, very mechanical, tiresome vehicle to drive. And then you get into Tiger with a gear lever this long and you change gear like this, you press the clutch pedal just like you would in a car. It's as far as the driver's concerned, it's beautiful. It even changes gear by itself. It doesn't need, once you've selected the gear, the tank does the rest. The disadvantage is the sheer noise inside. It's deafening, as is Centurion, of course.
What's it like, Mike, being sort of one of the very few people alive that's actually driven the
Terrifying.
Do you generally feel nervous every time?
Yes, I think all of us, only 4 people that have driven it, and we're all absolutely paranoid about looking after it because it's going to break one day and the poor person that's driving it is going to be notorious. It's going to be in the Daily Mail, the Sunday Express, you name it. It's going to be quite a traumatic experience, and it will happen one day, I'm sure. But for me, I feel privileged to drive it. I feel privileged to have been able to look after it for all of these years. Hopefully in the future, you never know.
Mike, always nice to see you, and I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you for all the years you've put into the tank and the museum. This collection wouldn't be what it is without you. so thank you again.
Thank you very much, Richard.
And we're now going to go on to our next segment, and our next segment is, once again, Richard Cutland is going to do some more exploring of the Tiger, and this time is going to be exploring the crew positions inside the tank, and Mike's going to be with him.
Hello and welcome to the Tank Museum here in Bombington. Join me today as we take a closer look inside the only running Tiger 1 in the world. It is, of course, Tiger 131. We're going to look at each of the 5 crew positions in detail to give you an idea of what it was like to operate and fight in a Tiger tank. Now, it's not easy to film inside tanks, so we're going to try something new. When I'm blocking the shot, I'll be ghosted out so you can get a better view of what is behind me. Let's start with what is arguably the most important role in the tank, the commander.
Only your clarity of thought, your assured order will give life to the Panzer. Direction to speed, decisive impact to the projectile. You hold a handful of trump cards, now learn to play the game.
So now I've dropped down into the commander's position. Now, of course, the commander was overall responsibility for the entire vehicle. Everything from the safety of the crew to issuing the fire orders and, of course, critically, the tactical movement of the vehicle itself to make sure it's in the right place at the right time. And most of the Tiger 1 commanders were experienced commanders. Now, what has he got around here? Well, straight away, you can see there's not an awful lot of room. On the hatch at the top, we've got the azimuth indicator ring. Now, the azimuth indicator ring is numbered from 1 to 12. And all that is a very quick way that the commander could lay the gunner onto a target. You'll see when we drop down into the gunner's seat that the gunner just to the left of him has got a very similar indicator panel there, which is also numbered 1 to 12. Underneath that, we've got a set of vision blocks, 5 in total, and these are actually fitted with 90mm laminated glass for a bit of protection and also a bit of visibility. Dropping further down inside here, what have we got? Well, just to the left, you can see we've got the Traverse hand wheel and also the Traverse gearbox. Now, I've actually had a go with traversing this, and I have to say, it is damn hard work manually traversing the turret of a Tiger 1. Just to the right of me, you can see where my right elbow is what they call the flash shield or heat shield, numerous names for it. But in essence, it's just a protective measure. Now, of course, when the gun fires, the breech recoils and you may get, in a bad circumstances, some flashback. So this was just a little means of protection there for the commander if something should go wrong there, so hopefully protect him a little bit more from the repercussions of firing. Moving on to some of the stowage positions and other things you can see around there. Well, just to the left and just above me here, we've got a hinge cover. Underneath there are 3 buttons, and these are the buttons that actually fire the multi-barreled smoke grenade discharges. You can see we've got 3 left and right located on the turret outside.
Some of the stowage things we've got on there, well, pretty obvious what this is. This is for the gas mask. Just to the left of that, we've got a stowage position actually for a flare pistol. Now, the flare pistol was really interesting. Now, it was actually used, if there was a problem with the communications, there were 40 different coloured cartridges that the tank was issued with, each one meaning different things as far as a tactical situation, etc., etc. But really interesting. And also, what it could double up as is a rudimentary grenade launchers. And they actually had 2 different types of grenade that were issued to the tank crew. Just to the left of that, we can see we've got another stowage here, probably stowage for the MP40 machine gun on there. And just to the left of that, talking still about small arms, of course, we've got a firing port. Now, the firing port, you can actually get an MP40 out through there, i.e. the barrel out there, and it just gives you, you know, if all hell breaks loose, somebody gets on the back decks of the vehicle, it's a way that the commander could fire his small arms from there. And that's it, really. That is the commander station up there. Of course, remember what I said there, you know, a really important guy, important for everything, the safety of the crew, and also putting the vehicle in the correct fire position at the correct time and identifying the enemy targets. Now, of course, the man who actually did the firing is the gunner, and we're going to drop down now and have a closer look at his position.
Aiming a shot into dead center is a matter of art, but not black magic. In order to shoot better than your opponent, you have been given the sharper weapon and the sharper mind. Using the 88, you can shoot off a mosquito's right canine tooth.
So I've dropped down now into the gunner's position. Now, the gunner's position, by far on any vehicle, the worst position to be in. The reason being, you're very confined. There is a very, distinct lack of space. And I remember from my time being a gunner, after a while, actually, your legs become quite numb. You can't stretch them out. You can't do anything. And on top of that, of course, what you have got is the commander sat right behind you, constantly getting excited, kicking you in the back. So not a great position. Now, some of the controls we've got down here, just to the right, I'll put you in perspective a bit, this is where the breech is. You've got the breech just to the right of where the gunner is at the moment, and obviously the critical thing for him, directly in front of him, we've got the binocular sight. This particular sight was the 9 Bravo. Good sight, very accurate, okay, certainly for the period anyway, and it gave him a 2.5 magnification and a field of view of 25 degrees. And if you look through there, what you actually can see is a set of inverted V's. But it's got a set of inverted V's there on the graphical pattern. This is just a way that the gunner could align onto target. Sometimes if he was doing aim-offs, i.e. the target was moving left to right, right to left, he could use that graphical pattern to actually lay off and accurately engage the target. Other things directly beneath that, we've got the Traverse hand wheel. Although there is a hand wheel for traverse by hand, incredibly hard. Again, even today on any vehicle, when you're powering a turret by hand, it takes a long, long time and a lot of effort to do it around. So what you have got on Tiger 1 is also powered traverse. Now, the control for the powered traverse was in the gunner's position, and it's a foot pedal right underneath my feet at the moment. Okay, so we had a foot pedal there for the powered traverse and could do about 360 degrees in around about 60 seconds, so not too bad at all, really. While we're down there, there is another foot pedal, and this is for the coaxially mounted MG34. It is a mechanical linkage, and like any mechanical linkage, again, even not just from this period, but up to modern day, that is prone to have problems. So after a while, things break, things snap, cables stretch, etc. So there is problems with any mechanical linkage. I mentioned earlier on in the commander's position that we had this azimuth indicator, and like I said then, we've got a replica of it, much smaller, different configuration, but just down here to the left of the gunner's position. Again, March 1 to 12. And a reminder, it's just a very quick way for the gunner, the commander, the gunner to lay each other onto targets so they can identify those targets and engage them a lot quicker. We then got, just to the left here, a vision block. Again, any gunner's position, it's a very rudimentary vision block. It doesn't really give you much of the outside world. And again, any time inside a gunner's position in a tank, you sort of lose all sense of perspective, time of day or night, etc., etc. But there is something, so we can occasionally see the outside world through there. Directly above that, we've got some breathing tubes, and just to the left of that, we've got an emergency gun firing circuit. So again, a backup facility in case anything does go wrong with the main firing circuit. We've got the ability to fire the main armament there. And that's it really for the gunner's position. As I said, a critical position for any crew, but again, as far as crew comfort was concerned, absolutely awful.
60 tons of steel and 700 horsepower serve only one purpose: to set in motion and protect the weaponry you operate. If you fail, all of that will be in vain. If you prove yourself competent, a multitude of enemy tonnage and horsepower will be destroyed with your aid.
So here we are now in the best position of any tank, and that's the loader's position. Why do I say the best position? Well, purely because you've got the most space, and I absolutely loved being a loader on a tank. Purely because it meant that when I couldn't get out of the tank, we had some time off, I could get my sleeping bag out and actually stretch out quite comfortably on here. Now, like any loader's position, the majority of the space is taken up with the breech ring assembly, which we've got here just to my right. Now, of course, the 88 was a big gun, and it was Hitler himself that insisted on fitting the gun to a tank chassis, and it had to go through considerable changes to enable this. The biggest issue, of course, was the recoil. The recoil was so vast that hydraulic buffer, which is just to the right of the gun, had to be fitted. This, for all intents and purposes, acts as a shock absorber and took out 25% of the recoil. On top of this, you had to have a hydropneumatic recuperator. Now, this took out another 5% of the recoil and also assisted the gun back into the firing position once it had actually fired. And the final part really of the recoil system was outside of the vehicle itself and the double muzzle brake on the gun. This also lessened the immense recoil. In fact, the muzzle brake was said to reduce the recoil by as much as 70% and was deemed so necessary that if it was damaged, then firing should immediately stop. What else can we see in here? Well, on top of the breech, we see the travel lock. When the gun was not in use, it secured the gun to prevent unnecessary strain and movement. Now, the crews complained that this travel lock was time-consuming to release when the gun was needed, and later production models actually saw a different design which was much easier to use. Just below that, we've got the empty propellant case catcher tray. And just to the right of that, we've got what's called the brawn arc. Now, the brawn arc you see even in today's modern main battle tanks, and really commonly referred to as the recoil indicator. What is it? Well, in essence, it's a safety feature, and it's a reminder of those fluids which I mentioned earlier, pertaining to the gun hydraulics. Now, the gun could recoil back to a massive 620 millimeters, and the gauge on there actually goes to 580, where there's a mark which says stop firing. So this was just a warning to the loader that at that point we should cease firing immediately and check the levels of hydraulic fluid within the gun. Just to the right of the breech, we've got another very important safety feature, and that is the safe fire lever. As the name suggests, this lever had to be in the fire position to enable the circuit to be made and the main armament to fire. Just to the right of the breech, we've got the mount for the MG34. Now, the MG34 could also be fired by the gunner via a foot pedal. The crews did report that it was a very awkward position to reload and also prone to stoppages, which reminds me of my days where it always seems that any coax we ever had mounted was also prone to stoppages. Just behind me, we can see we've got a vision block, and that's all the loader had was one vision block. So of course his vision of the outside world was extremely limited. At the moment, I'm sat on the loader's seat, which can be folded away, obviously to give him a bit more room when it actually comes to loading the main armament. Now, all around me, you can see stowage for the main armament ammunition, and there were 92 rounds in total, usually an equal split between high explosive and armoured piercing, and with single-piece ammunition, i.e. the propellant of the projectiles, were attached. Now, the armoured piercing round, the Panzergranate 39, weighed in at around 9.6 kilograms and could penetrate 10 centimetres of armour at 1,000 metres and 8.4 centimetres at 2,000 metres. So to put that in a bit of perspective, the M4A1 Sherman has got 7.4 centimetres of armour at its thickest point. So you can see that all of these rounds truly packed a powerful punch. The rounds were stowed in groups of 16, in side panniers over the tracks, and with more beside the driver. And there's also 6 more rounds under a hatch in the turret floor. What other things can we see around us? Well, just to my left here, we can see we've got gas mask storage. There's also a ventilation fan, because as you can imagine, when the whole crew is shut down, the air is pretty clammy in here. We've also got a very large emergency escape hatch. It's incredibly heavy, and it's actually in the Tiger Feeble mentioned that it must take care when doing that, because if you were to drop it, you're going to cause yourself some serious injury. The escape hatch was very useful for restowing the ammunition as well, directly into the turret. And that's it for the turret. As I say, the thing that strikes you most is the room you've got in here, and also everything is so well organised.
Your set reaches farther than the voice, the ear, the eye. It travels over a distance farther than a tank or projectile. The responsibility of whether it turns into a powerful and dangerous weapon or into a mean traitor is in your hands.
So here we are now in the bows of the vehicle, in the bow gunner stroke radio operator's position. Now you can see that the majority of the space is taken up with the transmission of the vehicle, so you can just imagine how noisy it must have been in here when the vehicle was actually running. Now communications-wise, just to the left of me you can see the radio sets. Now these are the standard German radios, the FU5, and it had a 10-watt transmitter and an ultra shortwave length receiver. The range for these radios was around about 4 to 6 kilometres. But of course, the range for any radio is heavily affected and influenced by the terrain. Calibration of the radios was a constant problem, as the constant vibration of the vehicle would cause damage of the frequencies and cause it to wander, so the radio operator was constantly readjusting it and putting the frequency back into tune. Directly in front of me, we can see we've got the mount for the MG34. And this is actually a ball mount. Now, what a ball mount means is that we've actually got some movement, of course, to allow for the bow gunner to aim onto the target. Now, the movement we had on here was 15 degrees to the left and right of centre, and -10 to +20 degrees of vertical movement. The only difference between the MG34 MAC to an armoured vehicle and those in the ground-mounted role was the fact that the barrel itself was 3/4 armoured, so a little bit of protection against shrapnel, etc. There would have been a canvas bag fitted here, which actually caught these spent cases. However, this one's missing at the particular moment. As far as the sighting system was concerned, we had what was called the KZF2 sight and brow pad. Now, it's interesting if you read some of the British reports on there, this was apparently incredibly uncomfortable for the bow gunner and actually quite hard for him to use and lay onto target accurately. The final things when you're looking around down here, just to the right where you see you've got the ball mount, you've also got the final drive filler point. As I mentioned before, the transmission assembly all the way around there, and just underneath the camera, so just away to my right here, we've also got lots of room for ammunition stowage. So that's it really for the bow gunner radio operator's position. As I said, there's not a lot of room in here. You can see already where I'm sat at the moment that you've got the butt of the MG34 there, so it must have been a very uncomfortable, a very hot with a transmission assembly, and a very difficult place to actually be a crewman from.
You drive a tank which has a few opponents worthy of note, but also very few brothers. It is up to you whether the Tiger is transformed into a predator waiting to pounce or into a heap of scrap metal.
So now we're going to have a look at the driver's position, and the first thing actually you do notice about the driver's position is he's actually offset, so he's sort of about here at the moment. So when you see all the movies and everything where they've got their heads out, it had to be somebody else perhaps sat on the side here. So to take us through some of the controls, looking at the startup procedure and obviously what it's actually like to drive the Tiger 1, we've got the expert himself, and Mike is back with us. Mike, thank you very much. Perhaps you want to just give us a quick tour of the driver's compartment.
Okay. So going from left to right, we've got a handbrake, which is the same as an old truck or a car. Underneath the handbrake are the disc brakes and the final drive. On the floor, we've got accelerator, clutch and brake, which is similar to a car. Going up, it's got a steering wheel, which hydraulically steers the tank through the final drive and steering, which is here on my right-hand side. In between my legs are two emergency steering levers, one for right, one for left, and then working round to the right is the gear change lever, and we can select anything from 1 to 8 forward gears or 1 to 5 reverse. Forward and reverse is achieved by this lever here, which we can select by pulling it up for reverse or pushing it down for forward gears. The instrument panel's just a normal one with some switches for lights and so on, rev counter, oil pressure gauge, water temperature gauge, and a fuse box here with different fuses for in terms of the tank. Up above there, there's storage for the optics for the turret. Interesting, there's a little vacuum unit here which slows everything down when the tank changes gear.
What about vision, Mike? When you're actually driving, I mean, it doesn't look like you can see an awful lot there.
Yeah, it's a bit like looking through a letterbox. And really the driver absolutely depends on the commander to steer him. He can see forward, but he can't see down or up or sideways even. So it really is guided by the commander telling the driver where to go and which way to turn.
And what about the startup procedure itself?
Right, the startup is once we've got the first parades done, one of the crew at the back of the tank turns on the master switch, followed by the fuel, and once all that's ready, we've got an ignition key that goes in here and a start button here. So you press the ignition key in, put it into number 1, and press the start button, and just a little bit of acceleration, making sure that the lever's in whatever gear you're going to start off in. You could go into 2, 3 or whatever, and the lever is in neutral. Once the tank starts up, you can't hear anything at all. It's so noisy, it's unbelievable, because the propeller shaft that drives from the engine to the gearbox comes down the centre of the tank, and everything shakes and rattles and goodness knows what. Also, it's very important that when the driver's pressing the start button, he keeps the steering wheel exactly left forward, because even if it turns just that much, the tank will gradually, what we call neutral turn, where one track goes forward and the other one goes left. So it's very important that the driver keeps the steering wheel exactly in the middle.
Is there anything when you're driving, I mean, certain gauges you have to keep an eye on or anything? What's the sort of most critical thing?
The most important thing of all is the rev counter, because the tank changes gear all by itself. So, for example, if we've selected forward lever, say we're on tarmac, we want to start off in 3, so the gear lever's in this position here. You lift the clutch as you would normally, and off you go, and the tank's rolling along. So you then put the lever into 4th, and when it's changed into 4th, all the driver does is press the lever into this gate and holds it for a few seconds, and then the tank does it all by itself. What happens is then that the engine revs drop, it starts to change gear. As it changes gears, it gives the engine a good hearty rev. The revs come back up, and all the driver's got to do is keep the rev counter in the green. If he doesn't, if he lets it drop below the green, then there isn't enough oil in the gearbox to change gear automatically. So it's really important that the driver keeps his eye on the rev counter at all times while he's changing gear. A very complicated system, but it's actually very, very nice to drive, because you can pre-select gears. You can, when you're going along in 4th, if you want to change it down to 2nd a bit later on, you put the gear lever in 2nd. When you reach the speed, press the lever over and it changes back down to 2nd.
So how would you, I mean, in your experience, I know you've driven an awful lot of vehicles in the museum itself. How would you say Tiger sort of compares to the rest of them?
Well,
I'm sure you've got a favourite.
Yeah, so Centurion's 5 out of 10 from difficulties. This is a 9.5.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because with tanks like the Centurion, they're quite well made and quite robust. And if you make the odd bad gear change, you get away with it.
Yeah.
This tank, you don't. It really is almost like finicky. It has to be driven properly all of the time. And so far, we haven't broken it.
Brilliant, Mike. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It was really interesting.
Okay.
So there you have it. That's the driver's position.
So that was our look at the 5 crew positions inside a Tiger 1 tank. Which seat do you think you would prefer?
That's a great look inside the Tiger there. It's a funny beast, isn't it? Because it's a big old tank, but it's much more cramped inside than you give it credit for.
Yeah, you're quite right, Richard. I think for me the surprising thing was how, I mean, like you say, you look from the outside, it looks like it's a big vehicle. And obviously, I've been in many turrets in my time, and it is very cramped inside there. And also, from a point of view of crew comfort, which for an old crewman like myself was incredibly important. There is a lot of stuff to hurt yourself on. There is a lot of stuff sticking out, and you have to really, certainly going down into the sort of gunner's position, limber down there. The bow gunner, you've got the machine gun in your face all the time. I mean, literally millimetres away from you. Yeah, so it's quite surprising.
How does that compare to sort of a modern tank like a Challenger 2 or something like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, Challenger, if you talk specifically about Challenger 2, Challenger 2 is actually a comfy turret. I mean, it's been well thought out. The ergonomics are quite nice.
It's got a kettle.
And it's got a BV, of course. It's not a kettle, it's a boiling vessel, Mr. Smith. Boiling vessel. But yeah, it's a comfy vehicle. I mean, certainly, nothing like compared to what they had to go through with this vehicle.
Cool. Well, you're watching today, you're watching us here at Bovington in the Tank Museum, where we're on Tiger Day Live. And this year's Tiger Day is a bit different to normal. Normally this is an event which we particularly focus on the Tank Museum exclusively. But today, because of the situation in Ukraine, we felt there's an opportunity here to work with another charity, War Child. And delighted again to welcome Tom and Dylan from War Child again, who are joining us to tell us a bit more about the charity and its work. So I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about how and why War Child became a charity in the first place.
Sure. So War Child was started about 27 years ago in response to the Bosnian conflict. And it was started by two filmmakers who were out on assignment there. And while they were filming, they were kind of shocked that there were all these aid agencies, but there didn't seem to be any that sort of responded to the specific needs of children, because children are impacted by conflict in a very specific way. Like, they're so young and these like traumatic and harrowing things are happening, and they need very specialist care, but also it's quite basic things like just a safe place to play or to learn. And so these two filmmakers happen to be quite well connected in the music industry. And so they kind of called in every favor they could and made this album called the Help album, which had songs from sort of any big act in the 90s, like Portishead, Radiohead, Oasis. Like, if they were big in the 90s, they were on it. And it made a ton of money. And essentially that money was used to set up War Child's first programs in Bosnia. And since then it's just grown bigger and better. But you know, originally it was this almost sort of spur of the moment thing that started out of the Bosnian conflict.
So 27 years down the line, where's the charity now?
I mean, I'd love to be able to sit here and say that there's no need for the charity, but you know, as we all know, unfortunately, that's not the reality. So, and I think the invasion in Ukraine as well shows that more than ever. You know, we are needed as a charity. Children are incredibly vulnerable, as Dylan says, and they just need that specialist care. And if the war in Ukraine was to end today, we think we'd still be there for 5 more years, because our work goes long into the future. So, you know, we do things in the short term and we provide that immediate aid, but we also stay there long after the cameras go home and provide long-term programs that help children deal with the traumas they've experienced. So yeah, I think we will exist for many years to come.
It's sad. It's a charity where the objective ultimately is not to be needed, isn't it? But there's so much need in the meantime. Now, you guys, I know, are long-term partners with World of Tanks and Wargaming. And that kind of partnerships, or those sorts of partnerships, must be quite unusual. Can you tell us a bit more about your work with the games industry?
Sure. Yeah, it is a little unusual. You know, we're one of the only charities that actually has a gaming team. Me and Tom are 2/3 of the gaming team. And it started about 15 years ago, actually in partnership with a game called Football Manager, which is quite a well-known football management game. And so essentially they give us 10p of every copy sold, which I think over the years that's come up to about £1.5 million that they've given us. And I think that really showed us the potential of working with the games industry to fundraise and to work in kind of mutually beneficial ways. And I think there's a real sort of connection between our work and the games industry, because, you know, we're a charity, we focus very much on that children like have a right to play, and like that's a really integral part of them. And I think that really resonates with the games industry. So, you know, since then our work with the games industry has really expanded. World of Tanks and Wargaming has been a long-standing, very generous partner who we've collaborated with many times and hopefully will for the future. But then we do all sorts of different things. For example, we work with sort of all sorts of kind of studios, from like very small indie studios to huge AAA studios. For example, we do like charity Steam sales, where we'll put on a sale and, you know, a percentage of every copy sold will come to us. We work with content creators on Twitch, doing charity streams, and you know, sometimes we do quite innovative stuff, like we'll collaborate on like DLCs. There's quite a famous DLC that we did with the game This War of Mine from 11-Bit Studios, which a lot of people still talk about quite fondly. So any way we can, we'll just work with the games industry to raise money for us, but to also, you know, help the games industry sort of, you know, give back a little bit. And we found that it's worked really well, and we're, you know, really excited for what the future holds.
Fantastic.
I realise it's a really difficult question, but I mean, where do you see the work of War Child in the Ukraine, you know, going in the future?
Yeah, I mean, as we say, we're expecting to be there a minimum of 5 years, and as the war stretches on, and, you know, we would love to see a resolution tomorrow, and that doesn't look like it's going to happen. So, you know, the longer the war goes on, the more devastation, the more damage to local communities and to families, and the longer that we're going to be required there. We will see our work transition from short-term aid and you know, sort of reintegrating children with their families where they've been displaced, and doing a lot of child safe areas for sort of in the borders, so things like trafficking don't happen, and we'll start to see that transition to community building and for advocacy and for things like that, where we're sort of looking a lot more long term, and you know, this could last 10, 15 years. We don't really know at this point. We don't know what the damage to local communities is going to be like, but we want to be there to support them and yeah, help however we can.
This is clearly not a one-off need. So there'd be a number of people who weren't watching before when we were speaking earlier. For their benefit and for everyone else who really like to get behind you guys, how can people support the work of War Child?
Cool. So there's two main ways you can do this. So of course, you can buy the emblems currently on sale on World of Tanks, and 100% of the proceeds of that will actually go to our Ukraine appeal. Or you can follow the Tiltify link, which I believe is on screen currently, and you can just donate there. And the money that is donated through there actually goes to our emergency fund, which goes to Ukraine, but also our work in countries like Yemen. And currently, any money donated via Tiltify will actually be matched by the UK government, and that's a scheme that's ongoing until the 31st of May.
So great cause. It'd be great if people can support in all those different ways, and that would be fantastic. But Tom, Dylan, thank you ever so much for coming and talking more about the work, and we wish you all the best in that work, and I hope it goes really well and that you can use that money really effectively. We're going to go on now to our next film, as we're here in Bovington live on Tiger Day. And the next film is Richard once again speaking with David Willey, the Tank Museum's curator, looking at the different variants of Tiger that fought throughout the Second World War.
So David, Tiger variants.
So with the Tiger, we see the famous Tiger 1 is made for about 2 years. But in those 2 years, till about August 1944, where the last one's come off the assembly line, there's changes that go on. So people will often, you'll see things like model makers, various people talk about early, middle, late production. And sometimes there's no official, this stops, this begins. Quite often in the factories, there's this idea of you use up the old stock of material before something new comes in. Sometimes new material gets at the front of the storeroom door. So the older stuff, it's only when you work your way back to the older stuff. So you get the weird situation that old style disc road wheels are put on a late production vehicle because they were probably at the back of the storeroom. So this, you can imagine, for the spotter is the absolute delight. And there's tables available where you can see where new amendments or changes come into service on the Tiger 1 and when they're stopped. So we're sitting on a tank before they put Zimmerit on, that paste that gives it the Ripley finish. They stopped that in pretty much September 44. Looks like they stopped it a bit earlier on some of the Tigers as well. So when you're looking at a Tiger, if you know what you're looking for and you've got good photographic evidence, you can place it in its production. The other problem you've then got as well when we're talking about this idea of variants, don't forget Tigers go back to the factory to get rebuilt when they're knocked out in action or they need an upgrade, etc. So you've got a fairly early Tiger can sometimes have late features put on it as they're trying to do it that way. So the whole of the Tiger 1 family, lots of subtle changes as it's going on. One key variant, and only I think it's about a dozen made, which is the Sturm Tiger. What they do is they get battle-weary Tiger 1s are actually taken back to, I think it's Alket, and they end up putting a new superstructure on the top with that whopping great big mortar on that is then used as a demolition gun. So not many of those, but you could call that a sub-variant of the Tiger 1. Now, in the background, the German military are looking at, and again on the insistence of Hitler, can we put the long-barreled 88, the L71 88mm gun onto a rotating tank chassis? They're going to put it on the Jagdpanther. Let's get it on a tank as well. So we've got that, what we know of as the King Tiger program going on in the background, and that overtakes Tiger 1. They're starting to be produced in the spring of 1944. They first see action in Normandy in July. They end up, this is stopped, and all the Tiger production goes over to the King Tiger. Now, we're really lucky here. Not only do we have a production King Tiger, but within the collection we've got a pre-production King Tiger, and that's the one people erroneously always say, you know, when we talk about these things, oh, it's got the Porsche turret on, hasn't it? No, it hasn't. Porsche had nothing to do with the turret. Sorry, you could be pedantic on these. Actually, again, he's designing a vehicle which will take that turret. Actually, they're being built by Krupp. His vehicle, yet again, is not going to be the successful winner of the competition. It's another hull by Henschel. So those turrets, the first 50, are actually in this different design to the production ones that Henschel makes, hence there's two different types of turrets on King Tigers. They also, unlike the Tiger ones, they go for a Jag Tiger. In other words, some sort of killer tank, 128mm gun. It doesn't have a rotating turret, but they're using the basic chassis of the King Tiger. They put a casement top on it, huge great thing, thick armour plate, 128mm. They're starting to make these, and even there Porsche's got his hand in trying to suggest better suspension units, etc. So you'll see these different types of Tigers in the Tiger family. He's even redone some of his earlier Tigers that end up becoming the Elephant. These are chassis that were going to be the Tiger 1 that get reformed, and again, casement put on top, 88mm gun put in it, and that becomes the Elephant, or later on it's renamed as part of its the Ferdinand, after Ferdinand Porsche, and they are see action on the Eastern Front. They're a bit of a failure. Many are brought back to the factory, they're rebuilt, they have trouble at the Battle of Kursk, they have a huge number of problems with their engines, but you could call those as part because they're really an output from the Tiger project. Didn't go the direction that the German military thought it was going to go in, but again, the Germans are famous for that. If you've got something, you tend to try to use it rather than put it to one side, which means an awful lot of their production, you get so many different variations on a theme. Again, one of the downsides of the German tank industry in World War II, just think of the supply issues for just the number of different variants they've got in service, even if some of them do end up having the same engine.
Thank you, David.
You're watching Tiger Day live here at the Tank Museum in Bovington in the south of England. We've been having a cracking day here looking at the Tiger, and Richard's been climbing all over things, trying to break it, not succeeding. Sure, it wasn't meant to go bang like that. But it's been terrific, and we've had a wonderful display of tanks, and we're going to have a bit of a recap thinking about over the event today. And it's been great, hasn't it?
It has been incredible. I mean, there's a lot of questions that crop up, Richard, about sort of Tiger 131. I mean, for you as the director, what would you sum up as the importance of that one tank out of your vast collection?
It's a really strange one, because on one level, it is only one tank. And we've got a lot of tanks here in the collection. We've got about 350 tanks here in Bovington. So at one level, it's only one tank. At another level, the Tiger as a tank is so iconic of the Germans in the Second World War. This is the sort of the power play game. And because it's the only working one, there's something different about a tank that works. So the Tigers are special on themselves, but this Tiger is different altogether. So I think we would describe it normally as a hero object. That people want to see that in particular more than other things.
It is, I mean, it's that popularity. We discussed this, we've always discussed this with various people. I mean, I had a chat with David about the popularity of 131, but I mean, from your personal sort of standpoint, what makes it this vehicle? I mean, we've just seen the sheer number of people that turned out today to see this tank.
Yeah, there's only so many tanks for which 4,500 people would come out. And some of these people, and we met someone earlier who come out from America. We got people from Japan here, all over the world, have come to see Tiger Day. And I think it's a mixture of things. It's the vehicle itself is impressive. There's the iconography around the Tiger. There's for a modern audience. Yeah, if there's a boss tank in a game, it's going to be a Tiger. It's a strange phenomenon. But then again, yeah, David Ayer wanted to have it in the movie.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's, like you say, Fury. But I mean, why in the first place was it restored? I mean, and the length of, I mean, how long did it take to restore this vehicle?
It was, well, you could say it was a huge job that isn't necessarily completely finished, and it started in 2004. The logic of restoring it was really around the fame of tigers and the recognising as well that there weren't any running tigers in the world at that point. And ours was a very complete vehicle, so therefore it was restorable. And actually, and we'll talk later on about the challenges of restoring vehicles, having all the bits gives you a really serious head start. But yeah, we've come out of it with the world's only working Tiger tank. It's a tank with a story to it. It's got a history to it. You know where it came from, and it was one of the most significant projects the Tank Museum's ever undertaken.
And you mentioned about Fury. I mean, very quickly, there must be some challenges. I would have thought the initial one was, do we allow it to be used in the film Fury in the first place?
It was a big call actually using this tank for the Fury movie. And this is a tank where it hadn't been off the site since it came here in the early 50s. We'd never worked with a Hollywood movie on that sort of scale in that sort of way before. And for the tank to leave the site at all was a big call. And it to be run for a movie rather than running for a physical audience on the site was also a big call. If we broke that tank in front of an audience here at Tiger Day, then you can say all these people got to see it. If we broke it on the set of a movie, then that would be a bit of a sucky teeth moment, wouldn't it? So the crunch part of the decision was we're here to tell stories. And actually, if we could tell those stories to a bigger audience, we were doing our job better. And we had confidence that David Ayer wanted to use it well. And we also had confidence that they would look after it, and they really pushed the boat out to make sure they looked after it. So in the scene where it's fighting in the field and Brad Pitt knocks it out and all that kind of stuff, they actually built a concrete road across that field for the Tigers to drive down. Because we were concerned that it wouldn't be able to tackle the field because it's such a heavy tank. They weren't very good at tackling ploughed fields in 1944, let alone in 2015 or whatever it was. So they really went to the nth degree. It's actually they looked after it very well.
And finally, Richard, I mean, the fantastic work you do down here, we mentioned a bit earlier, of course. I mean, how can people support you in the incredible work?
Yeah, and the Tank Museum's a charity. We exist to tell story of tanks and the people who serve with them, and it takes resources to do it. And it's a world where the more resources we have, the better we can tell those stories and the better we can look after the stuff. And there are a number of ways people can help us look after Tiger 131 and the other vehicles in the collection. You can watch live streams like this, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can support us through Patreon, you can physically come and visit the museum. It's a great way to support us, that works really well. You can buy merchandise from our shop. We've got a variety of casually placed items all around us. You can donate through PayPal to donate as well. There's all sorts of ways people can support us. But if you've not been to the Tank Museum before, I would say straightforwardly, people should come and visit. And if you're thinking about a day to come, Tank Fest is at the end of June. So Tank Fest last weekend in June, keep an eye out for it. We'll have a terrific lineup of vehicles in the world's biggest historic live display, and World of Tanks will be there too.
We will. Richard, is there anything you're allowed to give away about changes to the collection at the moment? So, I mean, is there any plans on the horizon, or is it all complete top secret?
We're collecting a lot of stuff at the moment. There's a lot of areas have been downsizing. So the British Army collection, for instance, as downsized vehicles they didn't think were directly relevant for teaching purposes anymore. So we've had half dozen vehicles came in recently from them. I think we've had about 10 or 12 vehicles coming into the collection this year. And some nice vehicles, which again, Tank Fest will be the time to see them on display for the first time. The challenge actually of collecting that many vehicles is actually how to fit them all in. You'll notice tanks are not small. These are big beasties. So if you're trying to get a dozen extra vehicles into an already full shed, it's more than a game of Tetris. to try and make that work. So so one of the challenges actually we've got over the next few months is looking to make sure we've got the right fleet of vehicles. And the tank museums are like trees. If you want them to be healthy, they do need pruning. So actually one of the things we've got to do over this next year is actually start thinking about which vehicles don't need to be kept on this site, and looking at what vehicles we can have leave the collection and sort of make space for new stuff. But we're always keeping an eye out for things which fill gaps. And we've done quite well in recent years. So we've got a beautiful T3476 which has been on loan from our friends in Finland. We're looking. We've loaned our King Tiger, for instance, to the Swedes at the moment in the Arsenal Museum there. We're keeping an eye out for JS3. If anyone has a JS3 lying around, that's probably top of the collecting list at the moment. We're working in a living technology.
And what, I mean, you as an individual, Richard, I mean, you've been with the museum now for, good heavens, it seems
16 years last month.
I didn't like to say, I wasn't going to say that, but I was going to say a fair while.
I joined straight from school, as you can probably tell.
What's the best part of your job, do you think?
There's lots of best bits of my job. The best part every day is walking down the pathway to the museum and having the realisation I work here. It's a feeling that after 16 years is yet to wear off. And I always say I love my job every day. I like it most days, but I love my job every day. And actually the moment of walking down the path towards the museum, it's a walk. You took that walk from when you were a young lad joining up in Bovington yourself.
I mean, we've had this discussion many times, but for me, the tank is probably more than just the tank museum to me. I mean, it's sort of like doing my basic training across the road, and this was a long time ago. And coming across here as a young lad, having a cup of tea in the cafe here, and it means such a lot. And you see that, but don't you see that with veterans as well when they come down here? And I'm not talking just about obviously World War II. I mean, even the more modern veterans, if there is such a thing, of course, it's got a lot of significance, this place.
Yeah, we've got an Afghanistan display which looks at particularly the events around sort of 2009, 2010. And we had guys bringing their families to explain what their experience was like. And we're a place where you can relate to the experiences of people who aren't necessarily always used to explaining that kind of stuff. So this place is of huge significance, both as a collection to the people stories that we tell, and hopefully will be for many years to come.
Richard, thank you so much. And that really brings us to the end of our historical segment of this. However, please do stay around. We are going to have a bit of a battle, me and Richard, later. He has promised to take it easy on me. We're also joined again now by Chris van Schoenenberg, who's as you remember, who came on earlier, the expert there to answer a few questions as well. So I'm going to pass you back across to David, who, and hopefully we can fend off some questions from him, we hope.
Hello and welcome back. I'm assuming you can see me. I'm hoping you can see me. I'm hoping for a thumbs up from the production side. Awesome. Excellent. So we have a bunch of questions that we've been collecting from the chat throughout the day. You're going to see me in a slightly different camera than before with a nice big shadows. It's late in the day and our wonderful historical guests and the museum guests, etc. are going to be able to answer a couple of questions. So while we're going to go through some gameplay really quickly with the Fury tank that we've seen today, one of the first questions that we had was how many tanks are in the tank museum collection?
About 350 at the moment.
Depends what you mean by a tank, really, doesn't it? But yeah, 350 is probably as good a number as any, isn't it?
We added 10 in the last month, so...
I love the way you looked at each other. And you're like, sort of,
it's
I'm
growing.
not entirely sure, to be honest.
And you can never have too many tanks, I think is the single most important thing you
Well, we
learn
say
from visiting
tanks
museum.
and large objects, and obviously that includes armoured vehicles as well.
There you go, David.
Okay, thank you very much. Essentially, lots more tanks. And so the second question that we had was, what is a tank suspension on the Tiger like? Is it hard to fix, and especially in a combat situation?
But it has a torsion bar suspension with obviously these famous overlapping wheels. So you always hear about the stories about how difficult it is to clean it all up in the Eastern Front, how it all froze up with mud and everything. Obviously, I've never experienced that, but I do see them wash the vehicle down after a muddy display, and it does take an awful lot to clean it. What's interesting about our suspension, since I've been here in the last 7 years, we've never had it off really. But it's the original torsion bar, the original road wheels even, so not just the wheels but also the tires are the original Second World War rubber still on the neoprene, as Mike always points out. So that's one of those, back to that discussion earlier on about when do you decide enough is enough. It's a very original suspension.
We were talking, I remember we discussed a bit with Mike about this, and obviously from my experience with the road wheel, it's fairly straightforward, but Mike was saying it's pretty, he did quote, it was 57 bolts at one point you had to remove just to get to one road wheel.
Yeah,
so.
there's a lot of, it's not a lot of overlapping, not straightforward. And the other thing, of course, in the arena, when you're then worried with gravel going around, you don't want them the gravel to chip off the original rubber compound, because that's been there for quite a while, so it would be nice to keep it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, and just to let people know, we are still live, so we're pulling questions from those. The Tiger 131, is it an early or a late model Tiger?
It's an early one.
Yeah. An early one. Thank you. And then, why is the Tiger 131 at the museum? Was another question.
I'll pick that one up. Thanks to the generosity of the German army in the Second World War. The absolutely key thing about Tiger 131, it was the first German Tiger tank to be captured intact by the British in the Second World War. So this was the vehicle that was then used for assessment to try and figure out what the hell do you do about one of these. So this was, it was when it was captured, it was paraded around so everyone could see this is what one is. It was then assessed, and we actually have the report about how it was assessed. And then after the war, it was held in the British Army collection, in teaching collection at Chertsey, I think, and that whole collection came here in the early 1950s, and it's been here ever since.
Okay, thank you. So at the start of World War II, did the French have the best heavy tank?
It depends what you mean by best, and it depends what you mean by heavy. The general line most people take was the Chaffee was arguably the best heavy, whatever that means, tank around. You've got to remember that the French do come second in 1940. And the Chaffee, for all of its impressive nature, it's got a good anti-tank gun, it's got the howitzer in the hull, it's very heavily armoured. There's an account of a Chaffee taking over 120 hits from German 20 mils during the course of the fighting. But the issue was how they were being used, and they were actually far too dispersed to deal with what the Germans were trying to do, which was this concentration of force and movement that just basically swept everything away. So, yes, the French had what you would probably call was the best heavy tank, but it didn't do them any good.
Excellent, thank you. And then another question we have is that they heard the Tiger main gun is actually an anti-aircraft weapon. Is that true?
Well, of course, it was designed as such, but I mean, it's the actual probability of. I mean, I think is the question: could they actually use it to shoot at aircraft? Well, like any MBT, there's a big theoretically yes. However, saying that, I mean, even on today's modern main battle tanks with integrated fire control systems and auto track and everything, it is incredibly hard to track and fire at anything that's moving at that sort of speed. So. Theoretically, I think it's a big, inverted commas, theoretically, yes.
Okay, thank you. And then what other tanks did the Tiger face through the various battles was the question, but answer it as you please.
And almost everything, really. So effectively this comes in 42, April 42. So in practice, everything after that, because the Tigers fought on effectively all fronts for the Germans, both in the desert, Western Front and Eastern Front. So you're talking everything from Sherman onwards is encountering Tigers. So the most numerous things they've been encountering would have been Shermans and T-34s, but everything else as well. They fought all the way through to the last battles in Berlin.
Okay, thank you very much. And then this is a more probably complicated question there, which is, are all the pieces on the Tiger 131 originals?
Good question for you, Chris.
From what I understand, a lot of the items are definitely correct Tiger 1 components. I believe the vast majority come with that vehicle, 131. The engine, as you probably know, has been replaced. But yeah, it's a very intact and original vehicle. I wouldn't say everything came from it, but I think the vast majority. But yeah, with a new motor that was used during the rebuild, or the second rebuild really. So yeah, we're lucky to have what we have, to have such a complete original vehicle with history.
Okay, thank you. The next one was the Tiger worthy for the German army?
Ooh,
Worthy.
worthy is an interesting word. Yes, because they lost. We should be very glad that the German army lost in the Second World War. It was a war-losing tank. If you look at the resource intensiveness of the Tiger, that approach to engineering, I would say, is actually one of the important reasons for the Germans' loss in the Second World War. The German army in the Second World War failed to appreciate logistics, failed to effectively, I would say, get value for money in terms of how it was using its resources. And those all contribute to its loss. So from the point of view of we should be really glad that the Germans lost and that much of the thinking involved in the Tiger tank was involved as the basis of the Germans' loss, I would say yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And I know this was an interesting question. How important was the Matilda II, and is it a bit of an underrated in its importance?
Ooh, can I tackle that?
We know you love the Matilda.
I like Matildas. Well, I do and I don't. It's the and Chris can talk much more than I can about the mechanics of the thing. When war broke out, Matilda II was the most up-to-date, most formidable tank in the world. If you look at its performance, for instance, in May 1940, the Germans didn't really even have an anti-tank gun that could touch it until they started using 88s in a direct fire capacity. It was the absolute bleeding edge of fighting power. It was also ridiculously expensive, which didn't do it any good and was actually far too complicated, which we found out ourselves doing a restoration a few years ago.
Yeah, talking about suspension, comparing it earlier to the torsion bar, the suspension of the Matilda II is quite something else. The amount of bearings we looked at in those road wheels in the suspension unit is quite amazing. So yes, an interesting vehicle, but you can see it's an early war vehicle. It's it's very peculiar, but fascinating vehicle.
Okay, all good. The Centurion has its gun in the crutch. Sorry, is that to save on hydraulic fluid?
No, the vehicle was donated to us late last year, but kindly by the Swiss. We had some issues with it over the last few weeks. We wanted to be a key vehicle for Tiger Day, its first outing, so we made sure the automotive system was in order. We had a fuel supply problem. It ran out of fuel, starvation a few times. It stopped because of in the arena. So we tackled that, realizing we still needed to do turret training on it. Bob is reading the manual basically, and Steve Latham, one of our long-term volunteers, used to serve on Centurion. So they're going to spend a quiet day together with the manual and the turret and do a full rehearsal on the turret. We didn't want to risk this totally intact vehicle. It's pristine. That has been probably in storage for 30 years, so we didn't want to push it until it's ready.
I think to make it clear, like when you say turret training, you mean obviously as well as how to actually work it. It's
how does it work, the stabilization,
aspects.
the whole gyros, the whole thing. So between the manual and the memories, hopefully they can get it going. But the vehicle is pristine, and I keep saying, a good example actually, I keep saying to the guys, I want this vehicle to be treated like Tiger, 3 times a year maybe out, no messing around with it, look after it, because it's beautiful. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. And then a slightly maybe controversial one was somebody's asking, how expensive was it to restore the Tiger 131?
Ooh, very good question. Again, I would emphasise the fact the restoration is still going on. So these things are never actually fully complete. We were enormously grateful actually when the bulk of the restoration work was done by a company called Abro, who were the company who actually did the Army's tank maintenance at the time when it was being restored from 2004-ish. And they put a huge amount of time and effort. I don't know if they ever fully quantified how much cost they did put into it, because I suspect if they did fully quantify it, they would probably be very depressed. To do the kind of scale of work done on it now would certainly cost well over £1 million.
Okay, thank you. And then I know this was a favourite in most of the community when they talk about the Tiger is, was there anything at the time that could take out the Tiger tank?
I'll tackle that. Yes. It's the short answer. A lot of things could take it out if they're close enough. So, and I gave the example earlier when we were talking about John Semken, tank commander, squadron leader in the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, taking out a Tiger with a normal 75 because of the high fire rate and basically smashing the front of the vehicle in. You could take out a Tiger with a piece of boggy ground because they're so heavy. Most things could take out a Tiger in one form or another from the right angle with the right shot or the right distance.
I think it's like we said earlier, there's no such thing as an impenetrable tank at all. There just isn't, so yeah.
But you still wouldn't want to bump into one
Exactly.
on a dark night.
On a dark night, yes.
Okay, thank you. And so in terms of enemy armoured vehicles, one of the questions was, what would you consider was the Tiger, well, it says Tiger 131, but a Tiger's main competition?
And the main competition, again, is
itself.
what you mean by itself, yeah. So the most numerous things it was fighting against were Shermans and T-34. So those are so there were 50,000-ish Shermans in total. No one's really sure, I think, how many T-34. 70,000 the number tends to get thrown around. Well, those aren't all wartime production within that 70,000. There were 1,300, well, 1,350 something Tigers. So it's fighting on all fronts. The things it's coming across most of these masses and masses of T-34s and Shermans, but it's coming across every other vehicle type as well. So, but the most frequently fought encounters would have been Shermans and T-34s.
Okay, thank you. And somebody's asking, how much does the Tiger weigh?
About 52 tons. Just over 50 tons. 52, 50, I think. Yeah. Give or take a bit.
Yeah, we had 62 for the King Tiger, so yes, that's right.
I might be a couple out on that. It's more than a Sherman.
Thank you. And then this one was, how are vehicles maintained to keep their condition?
Tiger we do a pre-event, we do a full inspection and a service on it, or an inspection, check everything, test run the vehicle, and we do the same post-event. Now next week, Wednesday, we'll run the vehicle again. We don't run it, but we inspect everything to make sure there are no leaks. And we also started taking oil samples more recently to analyze the oil to see if that would pick up if any of the bearings or anything is failing. You can actually read that mostly from the oil. So we're doing as much as we can. It's got an annual, or every second year, it gets a full oil change service. And every few years, every 5 years, we've taken the engine out to have a closer look at an internal inspection to see if anything is, any of the bearings or the bores are showing signs of wear and tear. So yeah, we're doing our best for visual inspections, oil analysis, and occasionally doing a part assembly to see if it needs further attention.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe an easy, maybe not, I'm not sure. Why is the Tiger tank so popular?
I think we've probably, to be fair, I think we've probably answered this a million times over the course of not just the live stream, but various things. I mean, everybody's got their way to think about it. Why, as I said, I always go back to the day when I was basic training across the road there. We came in, after hours, we were allowed in the army to have a look around, and everybody made a beeline for Tiger 1 because it was, I always go to the old adage, my wife, if I said to my wife, name a tank, she will say Tiger tank. So I think that probably sums it up, to be honest.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I believe that is going to be all the questions we have time for today, because I know that somebody has challenged somebody to a joust competition between the two of you. So I know we're going to go across there and see what we can do with that. And yeah, while we transition to that element, don't forget that you can also purchase the Warchild things. You can get ready with the Twitch drops and make sure everything's there. You can also download all the tanks. We have an invite code going on there. There is a code called Alpaca that you can check out to make sure that if you want to invite somebody to the game, you'll also get a Tiger 131 there as well. Thank you everybody for the questions on that. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them. We were slightly delayed today with a lot of things going on. Like was mentioned earlier with Richard, it's what happens with the live show. Live shows are never going according to the plan. And yeah, thank you very much for all our amazing hosts and guests. This is not the end of it, though. We are going to a 1v1 with Richard Cutland and Richard Smith shortly, and I believe we're ready to start that process now.
Good luck. Let's battle.
Let's battle. And we did have a practice earlier, and Richard cheated, but I won't tell you why he cheated, so I'm hoping he doesn't cheat again.
I hesitate to use the word cheat.
Something to do with gold ammunition, but I'm not going to say any more.
I would say it's more a question of using every possible advantage and making sure you have the right discussions before the game. And,
good opportunity here for people who haven't seen. We're making our way through the gaming zone. Been popular, Richard?
It has, and the thing is, what it does for us is that it helps bring the subject alive to a whole variety of people who otherwise wouldn't necessarily be the kind of people who think a museum is their native territory. So, given the fact the range of, say, 600 tanks in the games now, they're beautifully modelled, quite a few modelled on vehicles from the Tank Museum's collection. This is a really good chance for people to get to grips. This is an awesome exhibition for us.
Right, so Mr. Smith, when you tell me when you're settled in.
I'm ready.
I'm ready for a whooping.
Basically, you've got someone who works in a museum against someone with 20 years' worth of tank fighting experience here. So.
And I know you're going to cheat as well.
Now, I have to say, the modelling here is absolutely stunning. As someone who gets to see Tiger 131 on a very regular basis, this is really rather good. You can see it's actually the museum incarnation of tanks. It's got all its smoke projectors intact there.
And if you look closely enough, Mr. Smith, you'll actually see some damage.
You can indeed. There's a direct hit from a 6-pounder on the side there, and I believe the scar under the turret is in place as well. Oh, we're off. Oh,
and we're off.
Right, charge. I've just given away my strategy there.
I've got a good idea of where you're going to be, so remember firepower, protection, mobility.
Charge!
Oh, look at that!
Oh, he's popping them here. Now, that bit when there's a big flash and stuff like that means you're not doing well there, doesn't it?
It does. I think you're
Feel free to come out again.
You're just going to wait there, aren't you?
Isn't that it's a... Oi! What's this hold down rubbish?
Polar there.
I have to try and repair myself, don't I? How do I do it? Oh, hang on. It's number... Ah! Stop it! Oh, that's not going to happen.
Good showing, Mr. Smith. Good showing.
So the drive out into open territory tactic has flaws. Was that broadly what we're saying?
Let's not forget that tanks would never ever work on their own like this anyway.
I was waiting for the backup to go around the back of you see.
Okay, I've got one more.
Right, okay, right, this time.
Are you ready?
Yep. I do like the way this has been done.
It's a really popular in-game vehicle as well.
I'm not surprised. Is there? Oh yeah, there's the scar underneath. That's the shot that jams the turret in place, which is probably the coup de grace in terms of getting the crew to abandon it. That hit on the lifting bar there is a typical example of a direct hit from a British 6-pounder, which one tank commander described at the point when he said, I fired at a tank twice, both shots bounced off. It was a bit disheartening, which I thought was the most wonderful turn of phrase.
Where's our air support, Mr. Smith?
Oh, hang on.
You're up to no good. I can sort of hear you across the other booth.
Sorry?
You're up to no good. I can feel it.
No, so it's all part of a cunning plan here. I did get first shot advantage last time. It didn't do me any good whatsoever.
Oh, you're playing it safer this time.
We're going for a higher level of cunning this time. Oi! Pack it in! Bug up!
Inability to talk and play at the same time.
It's oh, hang on. Where's
the concentration here?
This is all going horribly wrong. I've lost sight of you as well, which is always bad.
As you know, Mr. Smith, IA drill. Fire one round, reverse that firing position.
I think it's not cricket. Oh, I'm toast.
Jolly well done.
Another hold down victory. You see, that's 20 years of working in tanks. You see, that gives a distinct advantage there.
That was just luck.
Marvellous. Well, played 2, lost 2. I'd like to think I tried jolly hard.
You did really well there. You did really well.
It's very close. I've got to say, that is an awesome modelling of the tank. I think that's terrific. Should we call that a day there?
That's it, yes, that's it. So we'd just like to say that's all from us here today. Thank you to you all so much for watching. Remember, if you can contribute towards War Child, whether it's via the emblems or of course directly to them, please do so. And from us to you, Richard, and all your team again, thank you for the hospitality, the knowledge, and for what you do down here.
It's always a pleasure, and thank you for your support and that of Wargaming over many years. I mean, we've worked with Wargaming now, I think it's 12 years now, which is fantastic. Thank you to everyone who's been watching the stream today. I hope you've learned more about Tiger 131, the work we do here at the Tank Museum. If you've enjoyed this, then do like us and subscribe on YouTube, support us through Patreon. Tank Fest is the next time you'll be able to see us. You'll be seeing a live stream there as well, and so you'll be able to, if you've enjoyed this, watch that as well. Tank Fest, still tickets available last weekend in June, so join us there. If you liked seeing Tiger virtually today, September this year, you'll have a chance to see the next Tiger Day as well here in Bovington, and we'll hopefully be able to see you then.